G'day, mate. 40 here. Is your penis racist? Believe me, this answer might shock you, and we're talking science here, guys. This is all peer-reviewed, so don't think this is just something just tossed off. All right, this is peer-reviewed, just like my first book, my magnum opus, A History of X, 100 Years in Sex and Film, peer-reviewed by Dr. Vern Buller, historian and sexologist at the California State University at Northridge, before Prometheus Books published it. Peer-reviewed, all right? Now, this work, this is academic, this is scientific, and I just got to assume that this is peer-reviewed, so you know it's good. All right, New York Post article, why your swipes on Hinge and OkCupid might be racist. Probably didn't even realize that your penis is racist. There's a new book out. It's by academics. It's called The Dating Divide, Race and Desire in the Era of Online Romance. And these three academics show how online dating sites exacerbate racial divisions. I thought online dating would bring people together. But no. Race-related preference filters on digital dating platforms help foster racist attitudes, especially toward black women. Now, I read about the porn industry for over a decade, and as part of my research, I realized that many prostitutes in their ads say, no black men. Like, I call upon whoever's going to be the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland right now is sitting before the United States Senate for a confirmation hearing, but no one is asking him about the civil rights issue of our time. Why isn't Senator Ted Cruz, why aren't the Republicans bombarding Merrick Garland with this gaping civil rights wound in our nation's psyche that so many of the finest, hottest, most exciting prostitutes say, no black men? They feel like black men have bigger dongs. They feel like black men are more likely to be violent and criminal. They feel like black men are more likely to give them STDs. They feel like, oh, just because a lot of their sisters have had negative experiences with black men, that somehow that makes discrimination okay. That it's okay for the higher end prostitutes to say, no black men. Like, how is this acceptable? Where is our civil rights division of the Justice Department? Why is not anyone bringing this up to Merrick Garland? How can we have an attorney general who refuses to talk about the civil rights issue of our time? Why do we have this wall of silence up? Why is it not socially acceptable to talk about all the hookers who refuse to service black men? How long are we going to maintain this wall of silence? How long, oh Lord? Like, I dream one day, black men will have equal access to the finest, non-black prostitutes, where black men who are Johns will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Like, just because a black John has black skin, really, you're going to say that, oh, he's more likely to have STDs? You're going to say, oh, he's more likely to be big down there, and therefore he's going to hurt me? Are you going to really claim that he's more likely to be criminally inclined and violent? Right? Enough already. All right? We can no longer judge Johns by the color of their skin. We must instead judge them by the content of their character. Like, so many black men. You're wondering why they're violent? Well, they're violent because these uptight, higher end escorts of many different races just refuse to have sex with them. It's a shanda. Filtering out people based on race is a normal practice on dating apps, and I think it's time we make it illegal, because there are just way too many penises out there and way too many vaginas out there that are racist, and we've just been turning a blind eye. Like, we just walk down the street and we pretend not to notice, there's a black penis. There's a racist vagina. There's a racist penis. We just pretend not to notice. We pretend that it's okay to have racial preferences when it comes to love and sex and marriage and dating. Racism, guys, it is literally built into the structure of these dating apps. Like, In any other sphere of life, the idea of having racial preferences is completely unacceptable. It's illegal. Why is it legal to have racial preferences about where you put your penis? I don't get that. Why are people allowed to racially discriminate when it comes to their pee-pee? Why are people allowed to racially discriminate when it comes to their vagina? Why is this okay? How is this not illegal? And you know who's suffering? Black women. Black women have a much harder time matching on dating apps, as do Black and Asian men. Most people apparently prefer to date within their own race. How is that acceptable? How is that even legal? So Black women in particular, they are subject to more exclusion and rejection than white, Latina, and Asians, female daters. Black women are the most likely of all races of women to be excluded from searches. Black women are also the most likely recipients of offensive messages. So discrimination is just part of the algorithms of mainstream dating apps or websites. I'm not talking about, the Daily Stormer dating app. I'm not talking about the American Renaissance dating app. I'm not talking about some kind of VDare dating app. I'm talking about the big ones, the mainstream ones. There's this idea that many people have that it's okay that, I prefer this race of people and I don't like this race of people for my sexual and romantic interests. Hinge, OkCupid, Plenty of Fish, Match.com, they all offer race and ethnicity filters. Tinder and Bumble do not. How is this okay? How is this legal? How do people not feel ashamed for having a racist penis? Like, up here, I'm not racist, right? No, up here, I'm Beverly Hills, but down here, I'm Compton. Like, down here, I'm racist. I mean, filtering for race lets people feel free to express their biases and their racial misogyny toward women of color in a way that they typically wouldn't do in a face-to-face encounter. And so how do these Black women, how do they go from being ignored to being harassed? Right, so the average dating app user doesn't see Black women because of the filters they've set. So those who do see Black women, you know why they're doing it? Because they've got a fetish. They're just fetishizing Black women. They're just objectifying Black women. They have their fantasies of Black women. They want to play, slave master and slave girl with Black women. Now, why is it okay to objectify women? How is that all right? We got Nicole, lovely 39-year-old Afro-Caribbean here in the New York Post article. She's a single mother from Brooklyn, and she keeps receiving overly sexual overtures from non-Black men on apps. And this has become an unwelcome norm. Now, right off the bat, these guys are approaching her with, "Hey, sexy chocolate," or "I love your beautiful Black body. Can you twerk?" Right? She's a registered nurse. How is this acceptable? Why is this okay? Nicole and other Black daters, they routinely endure racist attitudes. I mean, these women are trying to use these dating apps to find meaningful relationships, and these men are just treating Black women like sex objects. So one, it's not okay to not treat Black women like sex objects. And number two, it's not okay to treat Black women like sex objects. So you should neither treat Black women as sex objects or refuse to consider them as sex objects. Both should be illegal. A lot of Black women, they have to contend with all sorts of racist stereotypes, such as, she's Black, so she must be a sexually insatiable Jezebel. I mean, that kind of stereotype has its roots in slavery. And then there's the stereotype of the angry Black woman. Like, there's this widespread belief that, Black women are innately unruly and ill-tempered. I mean, we're talking here educated, refined Black women who are thriving in their careers. They're looking for comparable partners. But there's this complete disconnect between who they are in real life versus the Jezebel stereotype that they're subjected to online. There's Mish, a Black executive assistant. told the New York Post that her digital quest for companionship reaped a paltry handful of bad love connections. She's 53. Why should this 53-year-old black woman secretary not be overwhelmed by dudes who want to date her? She's feeling very turned off by dating sites right now. They're making her feel uneasy. Like, I'm not being seen as the beautiful queen I am. That is a direct quote from this New York Post article. She recalls one relationship with a Hispanic man that quickly turned sour. When we first met, he made a point of telling me how much he loved black women, that he was sexually aggressive during their first in-person meetup last year. So sexual aggression is just really the same as racism, because you've objectified people and you don't understand their totality. You just want to get off, get up, get off, get in. No, get up, get in, get off. And then when he finally engaged in consensual sex with her, he ghosted her. Then she found out this bloke, he had a long sordid history of fetishizing black women for his personal pleasure, then dumping them once he'd had his fun. I know a bloke, a friend of a friend, he got divorced, like successful Jewish guy in his 30s. He did nothing but date black women for a year. But date is, I'm using euphemisms here. He just plowed a furrow through 50 different black women in a year. He just used them for his own pleasure. He just humped them and pumped them and dumped them. Why is this okay? How come this isn't illegal? Like this Hispanic guy, he targeted black women because black women are seen as sexual objects, right? I don't know about you, but pretty much every bloke I talk to, I say, picture a sexual object, and they always come up with like black woman, right? And so many guys are just targeting black women because they're seen purely as sexual objects and nothing more. Then what about black gay men? Black gay men, they're subjected to hypersexualized stereotypes. Clark is a 26-year-old urban contemporary choreographer. And he told the New York Post that his brush with racism ultimately got him banned from a leading date app. At first, this white guy was sweet, the Manhattan-based dancer explained, but after a few messages, he asked for nude pictures to see if the rumors about black guys are true. How is this acceptable? This is no way to conduct yourself on Grindr, right? You don't just send a few messages and then ask for nude pictures. Completely unacceptable. Then Clark responded to the request with a flurry of expletives. And then the guy who asked for the nude pictures reported Clark to the app administrators for cyberbullying, and he got banned from Grindr, I assume. He had to create a whole new account. He got attacked twice. Once by the white guy, and then once by the white supremacists who run the dating app. So it's time that we do away with racial filters on dating apps to eliminate the perpetuation of racial stereotyping and discrimination. But they want you to know they are not bashing people for having a dating type. We're not dumping it on people's individual choices. We just want everyone to be aware of the long-standing societal issues being exacerbated on these online dating platforms. So many racist penises out there. It's frightening.
Only white, not only would be associated as white or would consider herself white, but is essentially white passing. So therefore, even if I was not hypothetically white, I could rake in the certain white privilege that, for example, or a black or Latino person couldn't.
This is what I've called the intersectional shakedown.
Yeah.
And the populations that are maximally irritating to the intersectional shakedown artists are the populations with recent claims to oppression that are nevertheless making it economically. Because really what it is an attempt to take a real history of oppression and to turn it into cash.
Yes, well, I tweeted literally today, moments before I came here, that the kind of idea of cultural appropriation, that debate makes perfect sense in a culture where identity is viewed as a form of capital. Because it becomes then a zero-sum game. If somebody like Rachel Dolezal, right, perpetuates this myth that she's a black woman, she is basically taking food out of the mouth, power out of the hands of an actually black woman.
Right. So there's that absurdity, but then we actually have to contend with the weird aspect. For example, if you look at the exploitation of black musicians, who very often, at some point you had a lot of illiterate genius musicians in the Delta who were brilliant enough to produce great music, but weren't capable of defending themselves in a legal structure.
Right, exactly.
And so you actually had cultural exploitation of one group by another through appropriation. So you'd get, I think at some point I saw Otis Blackwell performing in New York City, and he had to say, look, I'm the guy behind Elvis Presley.
Right.
And the idea is that when Elvis sang it, it was acceptable to a market that he couldn't sell into. So there is a real aspect to cultural appropriation and there's a totally fake aspect, which is this sort of, and they're coexisting. And so it's very tempting for people like us just to point at the bullshit. But there actually is this unfortunate reality that's braided with it.
Yeah, absolutely. No pun intended. Sorry.
Braid?
The box braids. No, but it's absolutely true. I mean, you can give the example of like Hesh in The Sopranos, right? We talked about the Sopranos at our power lunch. Who's this guy who's kind of this like kindly, sensible Jewish grandfather.
Within a mafia context.
Within a mafia context. Is so warm and loving and steadily. And this is a guy who has historically stiffed black musicians for royalties, right? And there's that famous reparations episode with, I think it was Bokeem Woodbine playing the rapper Mini Gark guy.
Well, there's a question about whether he's going to visit violence upon him, but it turns out he's going to visit a lawsuit.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But then you have like these cultural examples of like, like Katy Perry or Miley Cyrus wearing cornrows, like Kim Kardashian wearing cornrows in a Kardashian like beauty photo shoot, which I find completely preposterous. No one owns cornrows.
I don't know enough about female hairstyle.
There's no direct line of monetization, right?
Okay.
I don't see it that way. And so that's a discourse that I think, you're right, exists as like a proxy discourse because people are afraid to confront the deeper, more complex issues.
Well, I think that, and you have one set of legitimate issues acting as the stalking horse for this infernal shakedown. And my hatred of this comes from the fact that if American Jews who have made it financially in one generation are somehow safe and secure and therefore privileged, something is entirely broken with your cosmology.
Weinstein here.
How do you mean?
Well, it's just like I assume that the German Jews in before Kristall, the 2 nights before Kristallnacht were privileged and should be worried about their privilege. It's just, this is stupid.
Yeah, it's a silly argument. And I think, I get into spats about this and I'm frequently accused of like being racially insensitive. And I, as the late great Quentin Tarantino said, I reject that hypothesis. It's patently false. What I've always said is I'm not in the business. I'm not interested in having an oppression Olympics and saying like, well, okay, look, I come from a historically oppressed background on two sides, but I, grew up in a totally middle class milieu and, but I'm going to use this kind of identitarian card. I'm going to play the card to be oppressed. That's not at all what I'm interested in. What I'm saying is that as a person who comes from a different culture, I can view the legacy of American slavery at a critical distance in a way that American people may not be able to. Right? Because in Russia, you have a parallel system called serfdom.
Right.
The slaves and the serfs were emancipated within, I think, a year of each other.
Right. But I mean, I just had J.D. Vance in your chair.
I've heard only horrible things about him.
Oh,
yeah.
I'll introduce you. I like him quite a bit. He, his family, of course, is coming from Appalachia, and hillbillies were de facto enslaved.
Okay, so many racist penises right now watching this show. So let me talk to you heart to heart. Holly says, my mother told me if I date a non-white man, I'm more likely to get beat up by him. Was she wrong statistically? Yes. If you date an Asian man, I would say you are statistically speaking much less likely to get beaten up by him. I don't know how to do dating apps. I've tried a few times since the late 90s, but people on there freak me out. Well, that's because they're racist. Okay, Steve Saylor writes for National Review, is love colorblind? While interracial marriage is increasingly accepted by whites, surprising number of Asian men and black women are bitterly opposed. Why? This was published in 1997, so just 3 decades ago, Thurgood Marshall was only months away from appointment to the Supreme Court when he suffered an indignity that today seems just not just outrageous, but almost incomprehensible. He and his wife had found their dream house in a Virginia suburb of Washington, D.C., but they could not lawfully live together in that state. He was black and she was Asian. Fortunately for the Marshalls, in January 1967, the Supreme Court struck down the anti-interracial marriage laws in Virginia and 18 other states. And in 1967, these laws were not mere leftover scraps from an extinct era. 2 years before, at the crest of the Civil Rights Revolution, a Gallup poll found that 72% of Southern whites and 42% of Northern whites still wanted to ban interracial marriage.
Maybe a form of light slavery, if you will. Just serfdom is a different form of enslavement. With company towns, company script, company stores, company housing, private armies of detective agencies. So, the idea that is seen through the lens of white privilege shows you the mental impoverishment of the current woke ideology. And my claim is that we cannot afford to dispute it. We must ignore it just because it sort of shouldn't qualify intellectually. It didn't make...
I mean, as George Bush II said, don't negotiate with terrorists. And this is, I think, my big opposition to it is that woke ideology, by and large, is an emotional hostage situation. It really is. It's a hostage crisis.
Yeah. Well, you seem to be ignoring the credible threat to your reputation. In fact, it's making your reputation.
Yeah. But
so you're metabolizing this kind of weird resentment and hatred that people are experiencing through fear because these are reputational attacks. In general, they're attacks that say, I'm going to make it impossible for you to earn a normal living by making an attack on your reputation, which you need to negotiate the institutional world.
Yeah, and it's...
Okay, back to Steve Saylor here. So let's fast forward to the present. Another black-Asian couple, retired Green Beret Lieutenant Colonel Eldrick Woods Sr. and his Thai-born wife, Clotilda. They were not hounded by the police, just by journalists desperate to write more adulatory articles about how well they raised their son Tiger. The colossal popularity of young Tiger Woods and the homage paid his parents, remarkable evidence of white Americans' change in attitude toward what they formerly denounced as miscegenation. Tiger's famously mixed ancestry. Besides being black and Thai, he's also Chinese, white, and American Indian. Not merely tolerated by golf fans, many more than a few envision Tiger as a shining symbol of what America could become in a post-racial age. Interracial marriage is growing steadily. We're overcoming our racist penises, guys. From the 1960 to the 1990 census, white Asian married couples increased tenfold, black-white couples quadrupled. Reasons are obvious: greater integration and the decline of white racism. More subtly, interracial marriages are increasingly recognized as epitomizing what our society values most in a marriage, the triumph of true love over convenience and prudence. Nor is it surprising that white Asian marriages outnumber black-white marriages. Social distance between whites and Asians is now far smaller than the social distance between blacks and whites. What's fascinating is that in recent years, a startling number of non-whites, especially Asian men and black women, have become bitterly opposed to intermarriage. What kind of sick person doesn't celebrate racial intermarriage? Probably the most disastrous mistake Marsha Clark made in prosecuting O.J. Simpson was to complacently allow Johnny Cochran to pack the jury with black women. As a feminist, Mrs. Clark smugly assumed that all female jurors would identify with Nicole Simpson. She ignored pretrial research indicating that black women tended to see poor Nicole as the enemy, one of those beautiful blondes who steal successful black men from their black first wives and then deserve what they get. So the heart of the problem for Asian men and for black women is that intermarriage does not treat every sex-race combination equally. On average, it has offered black men and Asian women new opportunities for finding mates among whites, while exposing Asian men and black women to new competition from whites. In the 1990 census, 72% of black-white couples consist of a black husband and a white wife. In contrast, white-Asian pairs showed the reverse. 72% consisted of a white husband and an Asian wife.
It's like, it's Jordan Peterson famously said, like, I figured out a way to monetize the SJWs, and, you could possibly say that about Red Scare, but it's not kind of...
No, I think you guys are doing something much more bizarre.
Yeah, I agree. But it's not intended in that way. But that was never the premise or the interest. It was kind of this earnest, it was truly kind of an earnest frustration with liberal mainstream feminism and liberalism.
I don't even know whether it's liberalism. I mean, like, everything's so watered down and metastatic and bizarre.
Yeah.
That it's the vague whiff of the left gone mad.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not liberal. It's not progressive. We don't even know what it is. It just sort of technically
resides
to the left.
Conservative either, right?
No.
You can't rightfully call it that.
Self-hatred is obviously a very large part of it.
I think, self-hatred. I mean, this is another kind of, I repeat myself loudly and often.
Well done.
According to the advice of my hero Quentin Crisp, who said that was kind of the way to make yourself memorable. And the problem with the left, and I'm talking about kind of primarily the online left, is that these are people who are thoroughly infected with the virus of the neoliberal ethos. They play completely within the terms of the system. And, this brings to bear a very important point that I also like to repeat loudly and often by the New Left critic Christopher Lasch. And I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't know it verbatim because my synapses have been zapped by being too extremely online, But he said, like, hey, all the kind of traditional bedrocks, all the traditional values and institutions of liberal society.
So I was talking to my friend Yoshi Yobiyashi, the stand-up comic, and he was raving about Anna Khachiyan. She does this podcast called Red Scare. So... She's one of two women on this podcast. She's half Jewish, half Armenian. And he's been listening to all of her podcasts. Okay, let's get back to Steve Saylor here, writing an essay, Is Love Colorblind? Part of the problem for Asian men and black women is that intermarriage does not treat every sexual racial combination equally. On average, it has offered black men and Asian women new opportunities for finding mates, while exposing Asian men and black women to new competition from whites. Sexual relations outside of marriage, less fettered by issues of family approval and long-term practicality, they appear to be even more skewed. The 1992 Sex in America study found that 10 times more single white women than single white men reported that their most recent sex partner was black. Wow, 10 times more single white women and single white men reported that their most recent sex partner was black. Few whites comprehend the growing impact on minorities of these interracial husband-wife disparities. One reason is that the effect on whites has been balanced. Although white women hunting for husbands suffer more competition from Asian women, they also enjoy increased access to black men. The weight of numbers dilutes the effect on whites. In 1990, 1.46 million Asian women were married, compared to only 1.26 million Asian men. The net drain of 0.20, so 200,000 white husbands into marriages to Asian women, is too small to be noticed by the 75 million white women, except in Los Angeles and a few other cities with large Asian populations and high rates of intermarriage. Yet this 200,000 shortage of Asian wives leaves a high proportion of frustrated Asian bachelors in its wake. Black women's resentment of intermarriage is now a staple of daytime talk shows, hit movies like Waiting to Exhale, magazine articles. Black novelist B.B. Moore Campbell described her and her table mates' reactions upon seeing a black actor enter a restaurant with a blonde. In unison, we moaned, we groaned, we rolled our eyes heavenward. Then we all shook our heads as we lamented for the 10,000th time the perfidy of black men and cursed trespassing white women who dare to take our men. Like most guys, Asian men are reticent about admitting any frustrations in the mating game, but anger over intermarriage is visible on internet online discussion groups for young Asians, the men featuring an even greater than normal for the internet concentration of cranky bachelors accuse the women of racism for dating white guys. And then we, of course, had Elliot Rodger go postal. For example, this dating disparity is a manifestation of a silent conspiracy by the racist white society and self-hating Asian women to effect the genocide of Asian Americans. The women retort that the men are racist and sexist for getting sore about it. All they can agree upon is that media stereotypes and low self-esteem must somehow be at fault. Now let's review other facts about intermarriage and how they violate conventional social theories. 1. You would normally expect more black women than black men to marry whites because far more black women are in daily contact with whites. First, among blacks aged 20 to 39, there are about 10% more women than men alive. Another tenth of the black men in these prime marrying years are locked out of the marriage market because they are locked up in prison. Maybe twice that number are on probation or parole. So there may be nearly 14 young black women for every 10 young black men who are alive and unentangled with the law. Black women are far more prevalent than black men in universities, by 80% in grad schools, in corporate offices, and in other places where members of the bourgeoisie, black and white, meet their mates. Now, despite all these opportunities to meet white men, many middle-class black women have trouble landing satisfactory husbands. That they have made Terry Waiting to Exhale McMillan, author of novels specifically about and for them, into a best-selling brand name. Probably the most popular romance advice regularly offered to affluent black women of a certain age is to find true love in the brawny arms of a younger black man. Both Miss McMillan's 1996 bestseller, How Stella Got Her Groove Back, and the most celebrated of all books by black women, Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God, are romance novels about well-to-do older women and somewhat dangerous young men. As Miss Hurston herself learned at age 49, when she briefly married a 23-year-old gym coach. That seldom works out in real life. 2. Much more practical sounding advice would be, since there are so many unmarried Asian men and so many unmarried black women, perhaps they should find solace for their loneliness by marrying each other. Yet, when was the last time you saw an Asian man and a black woman together? I don't think I've ever seen that. Black man, Asian woman couples are quite unusual, but Asian man, black woman pairings are incomparably more rare. And we got similar patterns appearing in other contexts. Within races, blacks tend to most ardently pursue lighter-skinned, longer-haired black women. For example, Spike Lee's School Days, yet black women today do not generally prefer fairer men. In Britain, 40% of black men are married to or living with a white woman, versus only 21% of black women married to or living with a white man. Then in art, we have Madame Butterfly, a white man, Asian woman tragedy. It's been packing them in for a century, recently under the name Miss Saigon. The greatest black man, white woman story, Othello, has been an endless hit in both Shakespeare and Verdi's versions. So theater always repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as opera, and finally as farce, as seen in that recent smash, O.J., the Moor of Brentwood. Maybe Shakespeare did know a thing or two about humanity. America's leading portrayer of Othello, James Earl Jones, has twice fallen in love with and married the white actress playing opposite him as Desdemona.
We're talking about monogamy, marriage, the gender binary, any number of other kind of traditional values have already been dealt a serious blow by advanced capitalism itself, long before the social justice activists got their hands on them, before they mounted a fight against them. And that's a very important point to remember.
So the way I see it, and you'll let me know if this dovetails or in fact conflicts or maybe just total miss, is that the family and the religion or culture provide many of the same things that the market provides, like let's say an insurance policy. Right. So for example, if you're trying to smooth your income stream over a lifetime and you have recessions, a family might take in some members who are out of work and put them to work in portions of the family business that are still functioning or work inside the home in a way that sort of socializes some of the risk. And at the same time, you might buy some kind of a policy to try to smooth things out, or you'll try to save in an institutional context. As these things conflict, the market has denatured some of these older structures. When people talk about American families are weak, what they usually mean is that American markets have been regular and strong enough that people have leaned less on the pathologies of their mishpucha in order to try to get cleaner expressions within the market for their various needs. Like instead of having a mother come and be with a child when a new baby's born.
Do your laundry.
What?
Do your laundry.
That you hire somebody to do it. And the idea is if the market is working in some sense, the family starts to fall apart because you don't need it.
Right, exactly, yeah. And people are smart. They know that like 7-8 years of psychoanalysis is a very tall price to pay for having your mother come every week and do your laundry. And they'd rather be, and there's this, whole rhetoric now about a work-life balance, whatever. And I think that the market, part of the kind of let's say like the psychological anima of the market is that it provides people, with a scaffolding and infrastructure through which to relieve themselves of their family.
Right. So one of the things that's interesting to me is that you're coming from a background which is very familiar to me, where you have a Jewish Armenian parentage, and your father was a famous mathematician working in linear programming, sort of optimization science, and came up with this amazing algorithm that changed our picture for how things could be optimized using smaller and smaller ellipsoids. Right. And your mom, how did she figure into the story?
My dad, his whole kind of level of achievement is way over my head, obviously. But my mom and my dad, they met when they were very young. They got married quite a bit later. My mom, I think, would probably be very irate and disappointed if I described her like this, because she's going to listen to this. She is an artist, but who became a housewife, basically. Okay. And I think that she is the great genius of the family. She's the great kind of organizing and destructive force in my family.
Well, it's interesting. Very often, so I have to say that when we had this lunch, which you're describing as a power lunch, I drank no alcohol. So I'm not positive that it qualified.
Well, are you supposed to drink?
I don't really know. It would be my first power lunch.
Oh, right. I have to. It's just a stupid girl bossy hyperbolic term. I have to drink.
Okay. Well, very
and
good.
Smoke at all lunches. I didn't smoke.
You didn't smoke.
But I'm such a neurotic. I'm so shy. I was telling you that I can't. I have to constantly occupy.
Is that because you're reveling in your neuroticism?
No. I'm not like a Woody Allen person. I don't get off on it.
Okay, sure.
It's something that I hope to shed with the kind of accumulation of experience, like habituation. Okay. Yeah, that's not something I think you should look up to in yourself.
I don't know.
But yeah, I think that my mom is kind of like a bizarre, freewheeling artistic genius, a true eccentric, and I think that I derive a lot of my personality and my tendency toward critique from her. She's always spinning paranoid polemics about the world. It's really quite impressive, and she's right most of the time.
I think it's very strange that, this really actually echoes your earlier point, that we tend to see accomplishment only if it shows up in the workplace. And for a lot of us coming from kind of ethnic families, for lack of a better word, very often people who were inside the home were well known to be the local genius or the eccentric or the life or the whatever. It was not clear in any way that if you were the schmata salesman, that was really the higher expression of the two people in a marriage. And it happens that your father did something very creative in a very analytic context. It's hardly surprising. Like, there's nothing at all surprising to me that your mom might mostly be at home with the family and be the major force of the family.
Yeah, and I think my dad probably gets all the credit for being kind of the genius. My haters like to point out that I'm coasting off of my father's accomplishments, which is not true, because I'm actually way more famous than him on Reddit.
So there.
Yeah, there you go. He would be so. I'm here to disgrace my family name. But basically, I think that it's a very interesting. This kind of old breakdown of my parents' marriage is a very instructive example of the way that women wield unofficial power through the domestic sphere.
Again, it's like unofficial. Like, the language is even wrong to me. It's like, in what world do we not? I guess the idea is that it's official if it shows up in Wikipedia, and it's unofficial if it only shows up in family lore.
I think it's official if you're getting officially compensated for it, right?
Well, this is the issue of kin work that I would bring up, which is that I think that a lot of the wage gap work is extremely weak.
And I want you to know that this show has facilitated race mixing. Viewers of this show of different racial backgrounds have gotten together and gotten to know each other in a very intense, explicit, and intimate way. So I'm helping to bring the world together through radical love and inclusion. And you're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. And I got more funky music. Yeah. Get down, white boy. Get down, white boy. Everybody together now. All right, let's have a look at the chat. Showing off my great Seventh-day Adventist dancing there. Holly, the lawyer, says Marsha Clark screwed up that OJ case at the picking of the jury. Student says, I don't know any about anyone else. I just love touching black women's hair. Yep, absolutely. Same for me. I can't stop touching black women's hair. I've been arrested 3 times for doing that. Holly says, Marsha Clark failed to understand the hatred toward white women. I doubt the state had funds to hire a jury expert to advise. Well, I think they did, and she just ignored it. It didn't occur to Marsha Clark to hire a jury consultant. Christopher Darden should have had a clue. Grant says, I used to have a naked Asian dancer desktop plugin, but I think it was a Trojan. Can't even imagine the viral load that I got. Yeah, good. Apricot Sky soundtracks. Which is the shoegazy song? This is such intellectual preening. Tough to watch. Okay. Steve Saylor here. Civil rights revolution left husband-wife balances among interracial couples more unequal. Back in 1960, white husbands were seen in 50% of black-white couples versus only 28% in 1990, and in only 62% of white Asian couples versus 72% now. Why? Discrimination against black men and Asian women. In the Jim Crow South, black men wishing to date white women faced pressures ranging from raised eyebrows to lynch mobs. In contrast, the relatively high proportion of Asian men, white women couples in 1960s was a holdover caused by anti-Asian immigration laws that prevented women, mostly Chinese women, from joining the largely male pioneer immigrants. Though as late as 1930, Chinese Americans were 80% male. But the limited number of Chinese men who found wives in the mid-20th century included a relatively high fraction marrying white women. So as legal and social discrimination have lessened, natural inequalities have asserted themselves. Keeping black men and white women apart was the main purpose of Jim Crow. So Southern whites generally grasped that keeping blacks down also retarded their own economic progress, but whites felt that was the price they had to pay to make black men less attractive to white women. To the extent that white racism persists, it should limit the proportion of black man-white woman couples. Since these inequalities in interracial marriage are so contrary to conventional expectations, what causes them? So, what makes black more masculine seeming and Asians more feminine seeming? Media stereotypes are invoked. Conventional wisdom cites social conditioning. One reasonable cultural explanation for the sexual attractiveness of black men today is the hyper-masculinization of black life over the last few decades. To cite a benign aspect of this trend, if you followed the Olympics on TV since the 1960s, you've seen sprinters' victory celebrations evolve from genteel exercises in restraint into orgies of fist-pumping, trash-talking black machismo. So this showy masculinization of black behavior may be in part a delayed reaction to the long campaign by Southern white males to portray themselves as the man and the black man as the boy. But why did Jim Crow whites try so hard to demean black manhood? Chief reason was to prevent black men from impregnating white women. So did all racist whites a century ago make keeping minorities away from their women their highest priority? No. It was mainly keeping black men away from white women. So anti-Asian immigration laws kept Asian women out, forced many Asian immigrant bachelors to look for white women with mixed success. So why did whites historically dread the masculine charms of blacks more than they dreaded the masculine charms of Asian men? There are only 3 fundamental causes for the myriad ways that groups differ. The first is unsatisfying, but no doubt important, random flukes of history. The second, the favorite of Tom Sowell and Jared Diamond, is differences in geography and climate. The third reason is human biodiversity. Well, human biodiversity is fundamentally the product of the first 2 causes. So let's look at 3 physical differences between the races. Asian men tend to be shorter than white and black men. Does this matter in the dating game? So one of America's leading hands-on researchers into this question, the 7'1", 280-pound basketball legend Wilt Chamberlain, reports that in his ample experience, being tall and strong never hurt. Biological anthropologists confirm this, finding that taller tends to be better in the eyes of most women in just about all cultures. Like most traits, height is determined by the interaction of genetic and social factors such as nutrition. While the height gap between Japanese and whites narrowed significantly after World War II, this trend has slowed in recent years as well-fed Japanese began bumping up against their genetic limits. It can be rather cold comfort to a 5'7" Asian girl who is competing for dates with white and black guys averaging 5'11" to hear, "Your sons will grow on average a couple of inches taller than you," assuming, of course, that you ever meet a girl and have any kids. So, in contrast, consider a 5'1" Asian co-ed. Although she'd be happy with a 5'7" boyfriend, she were in an all-Asian school at UCLA. She finds lots of boys temptingly much taller than that, but few are Asian. So, I lost my virginity at UCLA to an Asian girl who was 4'10", and I was 6 foot. This general principle, the more racial integration there is, the more important become physical differences among the races, can also be seen with regard to hair length. The ability to grow long hair is a useful indicator of youth and good health. Ask anybody on chemotherapy. Since women do not go bald and can generally grow longer hair than men, most cultures associate longer hair with femininity. Although black's hair does not grow as long as white and Asian hair, that's not a problem for black women in all black societies. After integration, though, hair often becomes an intense concern for black women, competing with longer-haired women of other races. While intellectuals in black studies departments denounce Eurocentric standards of beauty, most black women respond more pragmatically. They one-up black women by buying straight from the source of the longest hair. So there's a booming business in furnishing African-American women with weaves and extensions harvested from the follicularly gifted women of China.
The Homosexuals, with CBS News correspondent Mike Wallace.
Homosexuality is an enigma. Even in this era of bold sexual mores, it remains a subject that people find disturbing, embarrassing, and the reluctance to discuss it. Yet there is a growing concern about homosexuals in society, about their increasing visibility. In preparing this broadcast, CBS News commissioned a survey by the Opinion Research Corporation into public attitudes toward homosexuality. We discovered that Americans consider homosexuality more harmful to society than adultery, abortion, or prostitution. We shall present other results of the survey later in the broadcast, and we shall investigate some of the medical, legal, and social aspects of homosexuality. But first, we shall examine it as a human condition.
Now, I know myself, from my own standpoint, and speaking of other people that I know, that the innermost aspects of a person's personality is his sexual orientation. And I can't imagine myself giving this up. And I don't think most other people who are sure of their sexuality, whether they're homosexuals or heterosexuals, could imagine giving that up either.
Warren Adkins is 28. He graduated from high school in Washington, D.C., went to night school for 3 years, then spent a year drifting around the country. He's back in Washington now, working as a school registrar. For the last 5 years, he's been an active member of the Mattachine Society, a homosexual organization.
What do you think caused your sexual orientation? Have you thought about it?
I have thought about it, but it really doesn't concern me very much. I never would imagine if I had blonde hair that I would worry about what genes and what chromosomes caused my blonde hair. Or if I had brown eyes. My homosexuality...
Okay, back to Steve Saylor here. Muscularity may most sharply differentiate the races in terms of sexual attractiveness. Women like men who are stronger than they are. Men like women who are rounder and softer. The ending of segregation in sports has made racial differences in muscularity harder to ignore. Although the men's 100-meter dash is among the world's most widely contested events, in the last 4 Olympics, all 32 finalists have been blacks of West African descent. Is muscularity quantifiable? PBS fitness expert Covert Bailey finds that he needs to recommend different goals in terms of percentage of body fat to his clients of different races. The standard goal for adult black men is 12% body fat versus 18% for Asian men. Goals for women are 7 points higher than for men of the same race. For interracial couples, their gender gaps in body fat goals correlate uncannily with their husband-wife proportions in the 1990 census. The goal for black men is 10 points lower than the goal for white women. Understanding the impact of genetic racial differences on American life is a necessity for anybody who wants to understand our increasingly complex society. For example, the sense of betrayal felt by Asian men makes sense. After all, they tend to surpass the national average in long-term virtues such as industry, self-restraint, and law-abidingness. These long-term virtues that society used to train young women to look for in a husband. Yet now that discrimination has finally declined enough for Asian men to expect to reap the rewards for fulfilling traditional American standards of manliness, our culture has largely lost interest in indoctrinating young women to prize those qualities. Frustrations of Asian men are a warning sign when, in the names of freedom and feminism, young women listen less to the hard-earned wisdom of older women about how to pick Mr. Right. They listen even more to their hormones. This allows cruder measures of a man's worth, like the size of his muscles, to return to prominence. The result is not a feminist utopia, but a society in which genetically gifted guys can more easily get away with acting like Mr. Wrong. George Orwell noted, to see what is in front of one's nose requires a constant struggle. We can no longer afford to have our public policy governed by fashionable philosophies which insist upon ignoring the obvious. The realities of interracial marriage, like those of professional sports, showed that diversity and integration turn out in practice to be fatal to the reigning assumption of racial uniformity. The courageous individuals in interracial marriages have moved farthest past old hostilities, yet they've discovered not the featureless landscape of utter equality as predicted by progressive pundits. Instead, they found a landscape rich with fascinating racial patterns. Intellectuals should stop dreading the ever-increasing evidence of human biodiversity and start delighting in it.
Sexuality to me is very much in the same category. I feel no more guilt about my homosexuality or about my sexual orientation than a person with blonde hair or with dark skin or with light skin would feel about what they had.
Did your parents know?
Yes, I told my parents myself when I was 14 years old. I feel in many ways that I've been very lucky to have such a warm and understanding family. They know about my homosexuality. They have accepted me as a...
So later on in this documentary, Mike Wallace narrates the average homosexual, if there be such, is promiscuous, is not interested or capable of a lasting relationship like that of a heterosexual marriage. His sex life, his love life, consists of a series of one-chance encounters at the clubs and the bars he inhabits, and even on the streets of the city, the pickup, the one-night stand. These are characteristics of the homosexual relationship. Wow.
Person, and this I feel is very important. They don't think of me as some kind of creature. I had one friend who was beaten savagely by his father, and he beat him, in fact, with bricks. I was one of the lucky ones. My family reacted, I think, very heroically and humanely.
Most homosexuals, if they had a chance to be heterosexual, would they?
Well, I have a friend who took a poll of 300 people on that very question. He asked them, if you were able to take a pill to change yourself from a homosexual to a heterosexual, would you do it? And something like 95% of them answered no.
But in that same poll, if I'm not mistaken, the majority said that they would not want, if they had one, a son or a brother to be a homosexual.
That's true. I think some people might not want to wish on others a situation in which society would cause problems for their younger people. And I think that this is probably true of questions where other minorities are involved in the same way. I think that many people, for example, wouldn't want to bring a racially mixed child into a world that scorned him. And I can understand this feeling among many people.
This man is 27, college educated. He was unable to hold a job because of his inability to contain his homosexual inclinations. He's been in jail 3 times for committing homosexual acts. If he is arrested once more, he faces the possibility of life prison. He is now on probation and in psychotherapy.
I had a very domineering mother, tyrant. That's a very sweet tyrant, but a tyrant nonetheless. It was a love that I had that was kind of killing. And I was a fat child and was made fun of by the other children. Mother.
Okay, you can find a link to this in the video
Welcome back to
description.
the long-awaited return
let's get some
of
more here
Radix
from-
Live. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Whereas in other societies, there's a kind of... I think there's... It's an interesting thing when you ask, like, what is liberalism? And that it seems to be... It has this, like, negative center, moral center to it. In the sense that, what does it really mean to be a liberal? I mean, they're, incoherent and contradictory in so many ways, but it kind of, what it means to be a liberal is to not be Hitler. There's, whereas in other societies, there's a kind of moral center that's that's based on an institution, or something like this, or God, or a book, or what have you. The institution of the moral center of liberalism seems to be a black hole. It's just pure negation. It's not being Hitler.
I mean, I guess I would see that as a kind of mask. For one thing, Hitler, like for instance, if we're talking about like Mexicans or blacks or something like this, right? The idea isn't, we can't have the attitude that Hitler had towards Mexicans or blacks, and that's the worst thing in the world, because famously wasn't all that racist of a view to begin with in some ways. But I mean, to me, anyway, I think and like I said, there are different sort of, in different societies and at different times, you call things the left or liberalism, and maybe there isn't one essential definition across all contexts, blah, blah, blah. But I think the most important, I think, understanding of it has a positive element, which is just a kind of rebellion against a set of pre-existing natural hierarchies in society, whereby mostly through tactics of subversion, those groups, which are naturally tend to be for different reasons depending on the group, towards the bottom of those hierarchies, attempt to not equalize but invert those hierarchies, right? And that, I mean, and to be a Nazi in our society is sort of just to think that virtually any kind of natural hierarchy is justified, right? That's what that functionally it means to be a Nazi in our society, is to think that we don't need to invert any of these hierarchies.
Well, but what does that mean for liberalism as a ruling hegemonic ideology? And it's funny because I tweeted about this last night. There's this spate of anti-Asian violence going on in I think San Francisco, but also New York City most prominently right now, where there's been lots of just street level brutality caught on camera. And this is overwhelmingly done by African Americans against Asians. And there's probably some interesting reasons why this is happening now, and how that relates even to COVID and the lockdowns and unemployment, all sorts of things. But that is the racial dynamic. And they responded to this by marching against white nationalism. I don't know of a single white nationalist who was engaged in anti-Asian street level violence recently, but that's what they march against. I mean, I joked that, white nationalists are behind this, and, the worst of all, to add insult to injury, they've been attacking Asians in blackface. But, it gets at this weird thing where the left at some point in time was a genuinely anti-authoritarian, anti-ruling class entity. But that is not where we are right now. We're kind of in this point of institutionalized revolution where, I mean, to say liberalism, whatever that might mean, but liberalism is hegemonic is redundant at this point. This is the ruling ideology of academia, the federal government, most churches, most chess clubs. I mean, is diversity, liberalism, individualism, liberation, etc. And again, how can this not eat its own, or how can this actually be a governing ideology in the future?
Well, in the long run, probably it can't, because it's just a conflict-oriented thing, and it's increasingly hard to sort of espouse the ideas of liberalism while being so obviously contradictory to them. But I mean, with respect to the sort of authoritarianism thing, I mean, I don't know how anti-authoritarianism liberalism really was. Maybe we want to section communism off as something that's not liberal and call that like the left versus liberal distinction or something like that. But even if you look at an American context, liberalism certainly, I mean, for one thing, we were not very tolerant of. I mean, fundamentally, what liberalism is not tolerant of is any kind of illiberalism. If you were a communist here in the 1920s or an anarchist or something like that, I don't think you would have thought much of the tolerance of liberalism. And moreover, I mean, liberalism is profoundly intolerant of illiberalism elsewhere in the world. I mean, the strategy for the first 200 years was literally just kill everyone if you're not on this liberalism thing. And then once we sort of, I don't think it's a coincidence that once liberalism really was quite dominant around the world, and moreover, left-wing people gained control over institutions, fairly quickly thereafter, those institutions became very authoritarian. I guess maybe I have a less liberal view of liberalism, so to speak, or the history thereof.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, on some level, like pure individual libertarianism demands a world government. I mean, because somewhere out there, someone's going to be oppressing someone, you know, in the sense of if that is your view, then you need to engage in a kind of infinite liberation of people. You can first liberate the slaves. You can then, liberate someone working in a sweatshop or forced labor or something. But then if that is your governing ideology, that is going to go to the church, to the family, to government, to maybe taxation. Who knows? It just kind of never ends. And I think you could see a little bit of this, animus, even certainly in Americanism, but even in so-called conservatives who were, Dick Cheney talking about women voting in Iraq and, little girls going to school finally and all this kind of stuff. This idea that someone out there is not liberal is kind of horrifying to the liberal mind. And it has to ultimately engage in a global revolution.
And I mean, that kind of attitude is also, I think, very good for the sustainability of liberal democracies, because sort of and the American Civil War is a good example of why this is. People naturally have a predisposition towards being tribal and hating another, and if in a democratic context, the group if you have a thing where society is divided into groups that increasingly hate each other, that's very threatening to a democratic system, because the whole basis of democracy is this idea that, look, our differences aren't that profound, we can get together and vote. And because people are naturally quite tribal and hateful, a way, and I think maybe the only way to really sustain that in the long run, is to get them to hate someone outside of the society, right? Which is why you have during wartime, right, everyone in the country is really on board on this sort of thing. And this is a kind of driving ethos of liberalism for a long time, is we can all unite. We have our differences, but we can unite because we're fighting the enemy, and the enemy is outside of our borders. And that was kind of a ticking time bomb situation, because we can say it was predictable because literally people wrote about this in the 30s and whatnot. It literally was predicted that if that's how the situation works, then once liberalism becomes dominant, obviously that strategy cannot perpetuate, and then you're going to have people starting to increasingly have to find that sort of satisfaction for their need to hate an outgroup within the society, and then that will lead to a kind of, sort of intolerant norms that mirrors what we see now.
Right. So I mean, Gina Carano is kind of right, basically. and if you don't have an evil, oppressive fascist in the Middle East that you can go to war with, and I think I don't expect any kind of Iraq-style campaign to come about in the foreseeable future. I think the American empire is actually kind of strained to a degree that we shouldn't underestimate. You have to create some kind of other within the society, and that could be Trump. It could be this vague white nationalism of New York City, which is attacking Asians at random in Chinatown or whatever. Or it might kind of be what Gina Carano is saying, which is that there needs to be an other within the society that needs to be crushed, and that can kind of take place on the level of canceling or outrage politics or social media shrillness, etc. But it might actually kind of eventuate in a physical confrontation with this other group that's used to unite a broader society that might actually fragment on its own.
Yeah, physical confrontation, or a sort of, I mean, the main way to avoid that historically in our society has been to just scare people into, well, you can't really have a physical confrontation because no one will admit to holding the views anymore. But we already see that. I mean, better than most people, if you went out, for instance, and just openly said, I agree with the median views of people on race in America circa 1950, the probability of you getting physically assaulted, is not that low. As it is, and that sort of bar just moves with time.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I think in some ways, like, the Biden ascension is about, at least rhetorically, it's about, back to normalcy. It's let's go back, 7 or 8 years where things were kind of happier pre-Trump. We'll all come together as Americans, et cetera, unity, et cetera. But I think that's really impossible. It's a kind of nostalgic vision for a stable society that I think is increasingly impossible.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's totally, obviously it's completely insane. The idea that we're going to have some kind of unity behind an ideology, which says that there's a moral impetus behind hating people that hold views that something like half the country holds. I mean, that's just, it doesn't take a genius.
Millennial Woes was banned from YouTube today, along with the Way of the World channel.
To figure out that's crazy.
Yeah,
and it's also it's kind of weird rhetoric. Biden obviously talks about unity constantly. This inauguration speech was very centric with it, and it sounded, I think, more than 7 years old. It reminded me of what a politician, especially a politician like him, a sort of Democratic Catholic politician, might have said about diversity sometime in the 90s or 80s.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because he's so old. That's literally, there's a reason for that. But yeah, I mean, this is just the unity stuff. I mean, obviously they don't want unity. It's a mask. I mean, for whatever reason, these people, and for an obvious reason, I guess they can't openly say what they're doing, but we all know what that unity ends up looking like. I mean, yeah, communists talked about unity too. And so,
yeah. Do you think, I mean, to go back to something that I brought up briefly, do you think the American empire is kind of more fragile than people imagine it? And it's a weird situation where there's not another serious competitor out there for defining a global geopolitics. Now, there's certainly China, although China has been and still is tightly integrated into the American empire in terms of manufacturing and consumerism, etc. There's certainly no Soviet Union, which was ideologically expressing, another way forward. But I've been thinking about this recently. I mean, maybe I'll kind of run this idea by you, but so the American empire is fundamentally about 1944 and Bretton Woods. It is fundamentally about a kind of planetary dollar system, and it has benefited from this in tremendous ways. Whether it's the dollar as a reserve currency, whether it's oil being priced in dollars, which has been, militarily enforced, and it is this, and it has allowed the United States to create debt like no other country has ever created debt and to effectively suffer no consequences. I mean, we like to say things like the American taxpayer is funding this welfare program, and the American taxpayer is funding this war overseas or whatever. The American taxpayer is not funding any of this. This is all funded through the creation of digits, effectively, through debt financing. And that at some point, this system is going to break down. And I think there's going to be kind of like a lot more things possible. And I think some kind of real ideological adversary will arise against America as it begins to fall. But, you look at all of these renewed, or not renewed, really new pushes for direct handouts, whether it's something like UBI, which was an unknown, concept 4 or 5 years ago, or barely known, is now actually pretty mainstream. The push for $2,000 a month, at the very least for 1 month, but maybe on an ongoing basis, due to COVID. Just the kind of reality setting in of the middle-class American dream not being possible. On both left and right, there is a renewed energy for direct populism, that is direct payments. And whereas the United States has been able to engage in just unbelievable type financing when it's throwing money at war, throwing money overseas, just creating almost infinite credit through the Federal Reserve and that kind of going into the financial system, sometimes equities, sometimes other things. Once there is this push from the public for direct payments, that this is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, if the government is giving everyone $1,000 a month, or the government's giving $2,000 to the public in a one-time or multi-time COVID payment, that money is going to be spent almost immediately. And some of it will go to pay off debt, but a lot of it is just going into the economy. And I hesitate to sound like a libertarian, but these kinds of things really are going to start creating inflation. And inflation creates a lot of uncertainty and additional angst. And it seems like this whole planetary dollar system is going to unwind because they can't maintain a middle-class lifestyle on the home front. That if they push all of these digits into the financial system or overseas or whatever, that they can maintain that because it is all kind of in the air. Once the rubber has to hit the road and they have to start paying all citizens just to maintain some kind of basic level of survival, then I think we might actually start to see the kind of unwinding of this system, serious inflation, a lot of moves to alternatives. I mean, we see this now with, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and so on. And that, maybe within the next 25 years, we're going to kind of start to see the unwinding of this empire.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. Certainly, there's more populist push for direct payments, and that puts stress on the financial system. Although we do have to say, obviously, that the elite establishment, such as it is, has done a reasonable job constraining this so far.
Yes,
they've not given people nearly as much money as they want. It looks like Biden probably won't even raise the minimum wage very significantly,
right,
etc. But the trends are what they are, and yeah, I mean, it seems inevitable that eventually this kind of debt will have some kind of profound effect, more than the effect that it's had thus far, aside from maybe inflation being higher than what it otherwise would have been, although it's been very low as it is. Obviously, it's just people lending money to the government rather than the sort of private economy and economic costs involved in that. But I think that it could, in terms of a looming sort of financial disaster that threatens the system at a fundamental level, that seems reasonably probable eventually. It's hard to put an exact date on it, but it'd be interesting to think about the ways in which that could break down. In America,
Okay, breaking news, cancel culture. The bloke who hosts Slate's daily podcast, The Gist, Mike Pesca, has been suspended from the company indefinitely without pay because he argued that in some contexts, white people should be allowed to say the N-word. This incident occurred Monday, February 15th in a Slack channel dedicated to discussions of media industry news. Now discussing the New York Times story about old white guy Donald G. McNeil getting fired from the paper because he used the N-word in the context of a conversation about racist language while chaperoning high school students on a 2019 trip to Peru. And the host of The Gist, Mike Pesca, now canceled because he says it's okay in some contexts for white people to say the N-word.
I mean, something that I think is a potential thing that could happen anyway is a kind of war, not a literal war, but a political war of welfare groups. Because if the American financial system and the government debt problem does become untenable, something that's immediately obvious is that there are two very large there's a division between our welfare payments. There's welfare for poor people and welfare for old people. And these are, very different things. And conservatives have said this for a long time, but I think it's reasonably likely to be true that a trigger for this could have to do with Social Security. And that would lead to a particular political scenario. I guess what I'm getting at is, depending on the exact trigger, I think the sort of political potential of that moment will differ quite a lot. Because if it's that kind of thing that happens, I'm not sure exactly how ideologically
Sorry, short loss.
well, I guess it's not clear to me that there's a great way to go in that moment.
Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. So today, it's a little bit earlier this week. It's not Wednesday, it is Monday, but we have so many things I want to talk about that I don't know what the news cycle is going to be like later this week, so I want to get it done this Monday. And of course, the first topic I want to discuss, which I was actually recording when this happened last week, but Rush Limbaugh passed away last week on Wednesday at the age of 70 from lung cancer. And a lot of the audience probably have their own opinions. I think most of the comments I was getting in live time last week about Rush is that most people had a very positive opinion about Rush. People were very bummed out that he passed away. He's a very important voice for conservatism, the American right, big time Trump supporter. And now there's a massive gap where he had hosted his show for 3 hours every day. No longer have any more Rush. Before Rush, there wasn't really a conservative media. And some people may be like, well, good, but despite a lot of the cringe and goofiness of conservative media, and a lot of conservative media is bad, not having conservative media is worse than the alternative of just everyone listening to CNN, NBC, and the major networks, New York Times, Washington Post for their news. It does offer an alternative for a lot of these people. And this is one of the best things about Rush, is that he was an alternative for millions of Americans, is that, he had 50 million Americans listen to him every day. And these people otherwise could have just gotten their news from the nightly news and heard about, look at how awful it is that the police murdered this innocent black man who was on his way to becoming an astronaut. And unfortunately, they killed him over, 2 cents in his pocket. And conservative media has been very good at, presenting the actual facts about these stories. I mean, we'd have probably never gotten the truth about Jussie Smollett without a lot of these conservative media outlets going in and being like, this is a hoax. Same with Trayvon Martin. Even though initially, I believe Rush Limbaugh thought that not Jussie Smollett, but Trayvon Martin had actually, he believed the real story, but, later on, he was one of the people who was presenting the real facts of the case. And there's several other examples of this. And it's just like from any topic you can imagine where the media already has its interpretation, such as immigration. We're helping out these poor illegal immigrants who would never commit a crime, never do anything wrong. And this is just going to make our economy work even better if we give them amnesty. This is somebody, Rush Limbaugh and, other conservative media outlets were able to present alternatives like, actually, it's going to be really bad if you pass amnesty. The same with gun control. If we listen to the mainstream media, you would think that crime would just end overnight with gun control. But thanks to people like Rush Limbaugh, you get the real facts that guns actually save lives. They actually help. And it's an integral part of our rights as Americans to be able to own a firearm. And this side of the story is never presented in the mainstream media. So a lot of people, I'll go into a little bit more further on this later on in the reactions to Rush Limbaugh's death. But this is something that people need to realize. I think a lot of our side think that, if we didn't have these people, they're just controlled opposition. And if we didn't have any conservatives on the radio, people would just be naturally disgusted by liberal media, and they would seek out, people further on the right, which, they're not on the radio and they're hard to find on the internet. thinking of this in the 1990s when, he was at his peak of popularity. I mean, he was still popular by the time he passed away. But, people had this interpretation without Rush Limbaugh acting as controlled opposition is like these 15 million Americans would have become, I don't know, like white nationalists or something. Some people on our side always think that, or they would have actually been, fully anti-conservative nationalists who wanted to take back their government. I don't think that was in the cards there. So yeah, he was in, he benefited heavily from the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, which was this stupid policy. This is really, I remember in the 2000s, people really wanted to bring this back during George W. Bush. Is that the Fairness Doctrine said that if you air anything on like radio or TV, you have to present the other side to counter it. And you have to give them equal time. And this is just such centrist stupidity where it's like we present rational opinions and we're all coming together to seek a logical endpoint to all these discussions. And it's like, well, if you have Rush Limbaugh for an hour, you then have to have Al Franken for an hour. That's like what the the Fairness Doctrine would have been. So people tried to dissuade a lot of their radio commentators from going into political commentary because they're like, well, if you're too get too far into it, we're gonna have to present the other side due to these stupid rules. And they got rid of it, and that allowed people like Rush Limbaugh to thrive. Is that before he was just a standard news commentator or a radio presenter, and then he went into political and social commentary after the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine, which then helped helped build the conservative movement for better or for worse. And I think in some ways that it gave people an alternative, because at this time in the 80s, you just had the you had the three major networks. CNN was just starting to get off the ground, but it was like not as big as it is now. I mean, it really took to the 90s for it to really become a big thing. And even then, it was still mostly news presenting rather than news commentary, even though it came from a pretty liberal perspective. All the major newspapers were liberal. I mean, they'd have several people putting this out in the remembrances is that the only conservative columnist they read is George Will, and George Will is terrible. I mean, he was even terrible back in the 80s. Not really in a different opinion, as that he would just repeat liberal talking points in a different fashion. So this is what people had, and then Rush Limbaugh helped develop something different, and then that led to Fox News and what we have now. And a final point about the Fairness Doctrine is that they were talking about bringing it back in the 2000s because liberals, this is a very funny thought, is they thought that we were living under conservative domination, that there was like a theocracy happening under George W. Bush, and this is all due to talk radio and Fox News. And like, we have to have Fairness Doctrine so we can have liberal talk radio. And this is at the time when they were really trying to develop Air America, which was like the alternative, the libtard alternative to Rush Limbaugh. And they had like Janine Garofalo. And I'm wondering if some of my listeners remember Janine Garofalo. She was a famous actress at the time who has not been heard of in the past like 15 years, but she was like a big lib at the time, and Fox News hated her. But these are the type of people that they developed on Air America, but it was a total failure. No one wanted to listen to it because liberals don't need talk radio when they could just open up Washington Post, New York Times, or watch CNN, or MSNBC was around in the 2000s. They could just turn on that and get all their news and information. Just the standard news that they hear in the nightly news, on the primary networks, was going to give them their worldview. So there was no reason for them to have talk radio, but they wanted to have this because they thought that talk radio and Fox News was too effective in the 2000s. So one of the big questions we have to ask is like, what was Rush Limbaugh's actual political ideology? What was his political philosophy? I mean, everyone calls him a conservative, but he had very populist style to it. I mean, most people noticed that before conservatism was pretty boring. It was like William F. Buckley affecting, trying to pretend he was a WASP and talking in a funny manner on a PBS show. And that was not a populist style at all. That was not going to win over millions of Americans to the cause of conservatism. It was, very much trying to be as hard as an egghead rather than a popular talk radio host. And so he really did have this way of just taking the ideology of National Review and being really concerned with tax cuts and limited government and portraying it in a way that could appeal to working class voters. And a lot of people, I think his main audience was across the classes. I mean, you had middle class, working class, upper class, all listening to Rush Limbaugh. It is very much of a particular generation. Is that many Gen Xers got into conservatism from Rush Limbaugh. I don't think many millennials, and certainly not many Zoomers, got into right-wing politics because of Rush Limbaugh, but many Gen Xers did, and of course Boomers liked Rush Limbaugh because, well, he was a Boomer himself. So it was a certain age demographic that really had an attachment to Rush Limbaugh when there was nothing at the time, and that they were still people who were listening regularly to radio. I guess people still listen to radio, or AM radio particularly, but he was able to offer them something that they had not heard before, especially from the radio. Rush's ideology changed over the years, and if you look at what he was in the 1990s, it was this very basic bitch kind of conservative who was emphasizing all these limited government and taxes, but he was engaged in some of the cultural war stuff, and a lot of people who listened in on Limbaugh were turning in because they were upset about the outrages that they were seeing around the 1992 LA riots, O.J. Simpson, affirmative action, and he did deal with these topics. And I think one thing you have to realize is that conservative movement was probably worse on some respects back in the 90s, particularly on trade, probably, and on immigration, even though there were a few, prominent restrictionists. On affirmative action, they were probably better because this was a mainstream talking point. Bob Dole, before the 1996 presidential election, proposed a bill to eliminate affirmative action, and you could never imagine any Republican doing that today. Even though they will say that they oppose affirmative action, they couch it in terms of, oh, well, we're just defending Asians. We're so outraged that Asians aren't getting into Harvard that's the only reason we're mad about affirmative action. But denying whites jobs, qualified whites jobs, and giving it to an unqualified minority, that was a mainstream conservative talking point, and Rush Limbaugh talked about that back in the day. I remember as a kid, I was like 7 or 8, and my parents were listening to it, and I could even, hear him talking about affirmative action and how, it's hurting whites. But on a lot of the topics that we still care about, he was not very good on. I mean, Peter Brimlow wrote in articles on VDare that, he went up to him and talked to him at these, dinner parties in the mid-90s, and he asked him about immigration, and Rush Limbaugh would get a very serious face, and it's like, I haven't made my decision on it, and he kept saying this throughout the 90s, and it was a big topic in the 1990s. I mean, the Barbara Jordan report came out. Barbara Jordan was a very prominent black Democrat, I think she was the first black woman to be elected to Congress, big-time civil rights icon, and she proposed this report that called for massive reduction in immigration to help out American workers, and Bill Clinton endorsed it, and there was a brief time period in 1995, 1996 where there was this window to get immigration restriction done. If Rush Limbaugh had endorsed it and had pushed for it, it may have likely passed, and we would have a better country today, but for whatever reason he didn't support or endorse it. But there was a bill that Bill Clinton endorsed that Rush Limbaugh was active in helping pass, and that was NAFTA. This is one of the real unforgivable sins that Limbaugh was involved in, is that in the early 90s he was a prominent advocate of NAFTA, and there was many conservatives who were not in favor of this. I mean, Pat Buchanan, of course, was opposed to it, and a lot of others who didn't even share Pat Buchanan's concerns about necessarily helping out American workers because, they're stereotypical idiotic conservatives. They still didn't like it because they thought it was going to undermine America's national sovereignty, which it did. And it also didn't help out our economy, and it didn't end immigration, which one of the advocates said that it would end most immigration from Mexico. Of course, that never happened. We're still having massive waves of illegal immigration from Mexico, even though it's been reduced over time. Most of our illegal immigration is coming from Central America. Proponents were still not correct in the end. And, but Rush Limbaugh was a prominent advocate of it. He argued with Ross Perot on national TV about it. And the Clinton White House thanked him as a distinguished American for helping pass this. And, Rush Limbaugh was a hardened Clinton foe. He was always promoting this stuff about every wrong thing that Bill Clinton was doing. But the Bill Clinton White House thanked him for helping pass NAFTA. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And even in 1996, when Pat Buchanan was running a very serious challenge for the presidency, in the Republican primary, Rush Limbaugh opposed Pat Buchanan in 96. Now, he supported him in 1992 when he ran against George H.W. Bush, and H.W. Bush was, of course, the incumbent president at the time. But he only supported Pat Buchanan as a protest vote, as a way of protesting George H.W. Bush raising taxes and, failing to uphold conservative orthodoxy. Well, in 1996, he opposed Pat Buchanan because Pat Buchanan was advocating for unconservative positions, such as demanding trade protection and wanting to end these free trade deals. And Rush Limbaugh was like, how could you do this? You can't. This is so unconservative. This is not conservatism. And he told his listeners at the time, I understand the anger behind these Pat Buchanan supporters, and the Republican Party needs to win them over, but I cannot stand his unconservative positions on trade. He didn't necessarily attack him on immigration and other things, but it was predominantly trade and a lot of these labor issues that he opposed Pat Buchanan on. So there was this stupid stuff involved. But over time, he's changed. And even in the mid-2010s, right before Trump, he was opposing trade deals. He was not in favor of these globalist trade deals. He opposed TPP, in 2015. I remember that vaguely, or not vaguely. I remember that clearly, at the time, because I was at the caller, and he was very much opposed to TPP for the same reasons that Jeff Sessions was opposed to it. It was going to increase immigration. It was going to undermine national sovereignty. It was going to undermine American jobs. So he did realize NAFTA over time was a mistake, and he did show some regret for that. I don't know necessarily if that compensates for him helping pass it, but that's something to keep in mind. And, he was in favor of Trump's tariffs on China, his trade wars, renegotiating NAFTA. So he did change on that subject. And he eventually came to make up his mind on immigration. And it was a way that was very close to, the dissident rights perspective, is that he was always talking about the threat of mass immigration and the threat it posed to American demographics and how Democrats were weaponizing it to change our country so they could have a permanent electoral majority. And it was a threat to our culture, and it was sounding more like Pat Buchanan. And over time, he became a huge Pat Buchanan fan. I mean, there are segments where he highlighted how awesome Pat Buchanan's 1992 RNC speech was. He also highlighted Sam Francis on a show. Very few conservatives want to talk about Sam Francis. And for listeners who don't know who Sam Francis is, he was a prominent paleo-conservative thinker who, he helped out with Pat Buchanan's 1992 and 96 campaign, was an informal advisor. He got fired from the Washington Times for being getting too woke on racial matters, but he was still one of the prominent conservative columnists at the time. It was a big deal that he got fired by the Washington Times, which was much more important then than it is now. And he, a lot of our, views and ideology, a lot of it comes from San Francisco. So he was a very important person, and he helped with Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. A lot of that book is Sam Francis's thinking. So if you ever want to, he has his own books out, but if you ever want to see his thinking, I would highly recommend picking up Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. So, and he was, Francis was, of course, excised from the conservative movement, become persona non grata. You can't mention him or praise him in any way if you want to be a respectable conservative. Well, in 2016, Pat Buchanan read an entire Sam Francis essay from, I think it was from 1996, on the air, and was highlighting about how this highlights, the Trump phenomenon that was going on in early 2016. And the whole essay was about, the rising up of middle American radicals, and how they're going to do something about this country. They're going to take it back. And it was very anti-globalism and anti-mass immigration and anti-liberal elite. And it's a very powerful essay. I think you should, I'm pretty sure you can find it online. It's called From Household to Nation. And you can, of course, find Rush Limbaugh's, transcript on where he read it as well online. And I highly recommend people to do that. And the SPLC, of course, attacked Rush Limbaugh for doing that, but he didn't apologize or anything. So this does show that, like, this person who was, like, in the 90s, you know, a stereotypical libertarian-ass conservative who was always, you know, really obsessed with limited government and taxes, and then he changed in the 2010s. Even before Trump, it was not, you know, necessarily Trump, you know, signaled a change, that he was already saying this stuff in 2014, 2015. And unlike a lot of prominent conservative commentators like Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, who considered endorsing amnesty, Rush Limbaugh came out immediately and was opposed to it, and due to, you know, him saying, I oppose this, don't vote for this, a lot of Republicans held the line in 2013 against amnesty. But unlike Sam Francis or Pappy Cannon, I don't think he could really articulate exactly how his, you know, worldview was different from, you know, the typical stale conservatism of National Review, or what he grew up with. That it was all emphasizing, you know, tax cuts and limited government, you know, zombie Reaganism, you would call it. And I think if you really want to know his political philosophy, it comes from this famous speech he did at 2009 CPAC. And I remember when the speech was on, that this is like the biggest speech ever. I think I watched it live for whatever reason. I think CNN was covering it. It was on a Saturday, so they were showing it. And he was up on stage, and he was like jumping up and down. He's like, ooh, and like everyone's like, yeah, this is going crazy. And, you know, throughout most of the 2000s, he was less relevant during the George W. Bush eras because he was just a cheerleader for George W. Bush. This is another unforgivable sin, or another serious problem with Rush Limbaugh, is at the time he was like supporting, you know, the Iraq War, everything Bush was doing, and you know, he had some personal issues at the time. He had to go to rehab for painkiller addiction. He got fired from ESPN for accurately saying that, you know, the sports media was obsessed with Donovan McNabb, who was a black Philadelphia Eagles quarterback. I almost said Philadelphia. He's not baseball, football, and he was you know, the sports media was enthralled with Donovan McNabb because they were always wanting to have the great black quarterback. And he was briefly an ESPN commentator. And he merely pointed out that the sports media wants this black quarterback to succeed because they, you know, that's their desire. And he, of course, got fired from ESPN for that. But the fact that ESPN would hire Rush Limbaugh as a commentator, you know, indicates how far ESPN has fallen from the early 2000s. You know, I think even if somebody, you know, a friend pointed this out, that if even like a prominent ESPN personality offered like condolences on Rush Limbaugh's death, that person probably, depending on who they were, probably would not get fired, but they would have to offer apology and a clarification on offering condolences for Rush Limbaugh. Be like, well, I didn't know that he was a racist and sexist, but, you know, we should always remember that he died. You know, somebody on ESPN, you know, an ESPN personality could not even remember Rush Limbaugh today, while in 2002, 2003, ESPN gave Rush Limbaugh a job. So that's one big difference between now and then. So after that brief just digression, now back to the 2009 CPAC, which, you know, at the Tea Party, at the dawn of the Tea Party era, you know, Rush Limbaugh emerged as, once again, more relevant because, I mean, he no longer had to be a George W. Bush cheerleader. He was now, he could now be free to say what he wanted, and he was seen as the doyen of the Tea Party, is that he was the guy that they listened to, and he was articulating their worldview on a daily basis on his radio show. And so here's how he described his conservative philosophy. This is from his 2009 CPAC speech, which everyone covered at the time. When we look out over the United States of America, when we are anywhere, I almost want to do a Rush Limbaugh impersonation. I won't punish my listeners with that. When we see a group of people such as this or anywhere, we see Americans. We see human beings. We don't see groups. We don't see victims. We don't see people we want to exploit. What we see is potential. We do not look out across the country and see the average American, the person that makes this country work. We do not see that person with contempt. We don't think that person doesn't have what it takes. We believe that person could be the best he or she wants to be if certain things are just removed from their path, like onerous taxes, regulations, and too much government. And it goes on to say about how conservatism believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we take it as sacred dogma that all men are created equal by their creator. And, you know, it's like stereotypical conservative tripe. But this is like how he articulated, and this is like almost a problem with even like the good conservative, you know, even like someone like Tucker Carlson, whenever they define like their natural political philosophy or like the basics of it, it gets into too much stereotypical conservatism. I mean, with Tucker, I think, you know, there was I think it was last year, I think it was in 2020 when he's defining like what the three things that, like the three principles the Republican Party should run on. And it was like very basic. I mean, it was stuff like he would support is like support for free speech and like equality before the law and everything that, yeah, you would theoretically support. But, you know, I think there's a little bit more like fundamental principles that you need to advocate for. And, you know, Rush Limbaugh was in the same case, that he really couldn't advocate for this position that, you know, we're conservatism, our right wing, our nationalism, we are fighting for the historic American nation, for the American people. That's how we define our nation. We define it through its people, not through these abstract values or, you know, this piece of paper that has changed over the years. Yes, the Constitution is important to American identity, but what's more important is the people who wrote it. And we want to preserve those people and make those people better. That's what our philosophy should be like. And that's something that a lot of these people cannot fully speak, they cannot fully articulate for whatever reason. I think there's a few people who would be able to say this. I think Sam Francis, of course, was one. Pappy Cannon's another. But for whatever reason, a lot of these even very good conservatives won't say that. And whenever they revert back to like, well...
Okay, so what about the racism that's endemic in the porn industry? So black and interracial porn returned in 1983, but is produced chiefly for the white porn consumer. Bill Margold, who directed 1983's classic Hot Chocolate, said that more blacks have been viewing this material is purely accidental. When I put blacks in my videos, I project my fantasies, not theirs. So much racism in the porn industry. Patrick Riley, porn critic, says the porn industry grinds in the most pejorative views of blacks it can find. All these ghetto movies. Pornographers perpetuate the stereotypical view of a shiftless, just out of prison, socially maladapted group. That's outrageous. Racism in porn. It's not some white actress who doesn't want to screw a black guy for whatever reason. Racism in porn is a concerted attempt by the producers to appeal to the basest elements of the viewing population. Why can't porn uplift us and bring us together instead of dragging us down? Like, the porn industry regards the use of blacks as a tax on their operations, rather than as the people they want to employ. Only an endemic, systemic, racist attitude by the industry, its customers, and its intermediaries is a reasonable explanation for all the widespread racism in porn. And David Aaron Clark, the late David Aaron Clark, wrote about porn archetypes, and one of them is La Exotica, referring to multi-ethnic morsels like Alicia Rio, Isis Nile, Uma, Trisha Van, Annabelle Chong. What do you mean we got no variety in these tapes? Bullfrogs, a personally offended smart producer. We got your Latinas, your Asians, your, I'm going to use the term African Americans instead of. So women of color appeal to their own racial constituencies and are a reliable cult flavor for the overwhelmingly white porn audience. As California, the home state of porn, becomes more diverse, the industry is flooded with Asian and Hispanic women. This is a blessing for brunette lovers, since most women from these races aren't even going to try to dye their hair blonde. We repeat, most. As far as cliches go, conventional wisdom has it that Latinas are more fiery, rapacious in the sack, and Asians more likely, well, I can't even say what they're more likely to do without complaining. So Angel Kelly was a black porn star. She grew up poor in Michigan. She was the only black in a crowd of rich kids. After a disagreement with her mother, she quit school, she left home. She worked as a runway model for 6 months, and she taught a dance class to such students as the future actress Portia Lynn. She did every type of scene but the backdoor scene in her 150 videos. And she worked continuously from 1986 until 1987. She earned several $100 starring in 150 sex videos. And her porn stardom helped her stripping career, where she brought in up to $4,000 a week, according to Essence magazine, November 1988. She entered the sex industry at age 19 by pleasuring herself behind a glass partition in a private booth while men looked on. She did find 6 months of this experience changed her. I began to look cheaper and sleazier. I began to see men in their truest form, and they are unbelievably sick. And it's hard to be an adult actress in the business, especially if you're black. The industry looks upon us performers with such disgust. I've never been rewarded with awards and magazine covers. Black women are hired to play hookers and maids. I've never earned residuals. Sometimes companies put sex scenes I've done in one video into a completely different video, and I've never earned a dime on them. She says her porn past haunts her. Would you believe this? Some men won't date her because she used to work in the sex business. Even after I'm dead, my videos will be out there. I've been swallowed up by the adult video industry. I feel used and cheated. And her experience with the porn industry was so horrible that she returned to it in 1996's My Baby Got Back 9. Largely because of her attitude, her return was greeted with little enthusiasm. So very few of porn stars are black, but porn female stars, but many of their male stars are black, such as Shawn Michaels, who moved from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. And when he directs movies, he likes to put inspiring commentary from Martin Luther King throughout the movie. And Shawn Michaels, for years, he did not want to have sex on camera with black girls. So he directed and produced 1993's classic erotica with an opening title that reads, "From the imagination of Shawn Michaels," on down to the quotes pleading for racial unity credited to him. John Michaels, who is responsible for the concept and dialogue, has just replaced Paul Thomas at the top of my list of most hated directors. And Michaels equates racial and gender equality. As a white male, I have far more in common, particularly regard sex, with Shawn Michaels than I do with any woman, black, white, or green. With women, this is a zero-sum game. Every time they go up, the cost of sex goes up, and the enjoyment to be derived goes down. I don't need a feminist morality play in the form of a porn tape. I used to think Shawn was a competent actor who just happened to have black skin, but now he preaches to the audience. Unlike his movie Butts of Fire, this movie, The Blues, doesn't have any repulsive pro-female propaganda, but it does harp on about equality. Shawn Michaels confuses anti-black discrimination with anti-ugly discrimination. To raise the quality of this movie, get rid of Toy and Dominique with their horrible bodies. So is porn racist? Yes, certainly elements of it are. Many whites and part Asians, such as Asia Carrera, show up in the big budget productions that end up in modified forms on cable. But cable TV companies, at least when I was writing this circa 2005, generally won't show interracial sex because it upsets many of their conservative customers in hotels in the South. When blacks show up in porn, the title of the video usually announces it as in Black Beauty or Black Velvet. And sex videos with interracial sex are usually low-budget affairs that don't appear on cable. So porn's leading white beauties received warnings from powerful pornographers to avoid blacks, whether on screen, whether stripping or in personal life. And if white Missy does not toe this racial line, she's regarded as white trash. So these are some of the porn stars who refuse to do scenes with black guys: Jasmine Aloha, Julia Ann, Blondie, Bunny Blue, Crystal Breeze, Cameo, Celeste, Barbara Dare, Raquel Darrian, Sabrina Dawn, Kylie Ireland, Jenna Jameson, Jill Kelly, Kia, Desiree Lane, Shayla Laveau, Hypatia Lee, Jordan Lee, Tracy Lords, Ginger Lynn, Paula Price, Kelly Richards, Savannah, Shane, Samantha Strong, Angela Summers, Jamie Summers, Nikki Tyler, Tori Wells, and Casey Williams. So performer Jordan Lee and her husband, manager Jerry, they hailed from the South. They sported swastika tattoos, and Jordan's longtime resistance to blacks caused many awkward situations on sets. One producer says blacks don't go over in the South. That's a big part of the market. Black girls, yes, as long as they aren't dominant. So porn tends to perpetuate stereotypes of black men as studs, such as Johnny Keys in Behind the Green Door. He was named Stud, and he was used as a tool. In Swedish Erotica 4, he is seduced by an aggressive Juliet Anderson, Art Peg, when she auditions him for a stud part in a movie. In another section of the same film, her sexy niece makes it with Johnny because she knew that Aunt Peg would only cast a real stud in his part. So black men in porn films, they are just used as animated phalluses. They're rarely given any acting to do. And it's outrageous how widespread this kind of discrimination is in real life, in Hollywood, on the internet. But we've got Dooovid. Dooovid, how are you? What's going on, sir?
Baruch Hashem, thank God.
So what have you been reading lately?
I've been reading these books on eugenics that, like I think I mentioned last time I was on the show with you, that I had heard a few lectures, local Holocaust events about a new push for eugenics education as part of mandatory Holocaust education. And so I started reading up on it. I found these interesting books that were written 100 years ago, largely Jewish pro-eugenic books like demography books. And then even today in Israel, eugenics is becoming quite popular again.
And tell me more. What were some of the things that grabbed your attention?
I was always curious, like, how the demographic shift happened that, Jews became so white. And I put together a lot of evidence over a large time span of corresponding text from various sources to make it appear that at a certain time, I'm guessing in the biblical period, that the ancient Israelites didn't view it as better to be white over black, that they thought it was superior that we're in the middle. And at a certain period, likely around 300 AD, the concept of it being worse to be black than to be white starts to become more common, till at about 1000 AD it becomes almost mainstream thought in Judeo-Christian theology that there's a connection between like sin and punishment for previous sin and having darker skin, and also the center of power where Jews are moving further north, and possibly persecution and assimilation, that there's multiple factors where Jews had a selecting breeding pressure to breed for lighter features. And I mean, like Kevin McDonald, you started talking about when I first started listening to you, pardon me, about Kevin McDonald and Jewish group evolutionary strategy. And most of the people watching are probably well familiar with ideas about how we produced high IQ. But I think at the same time, it's pretty clear that we bred for lighter features, and it was probably dual reason. One was theological, like just a thought that it's superior to be light, and then also just assimilation, a better future, that it appeared that Jews would have a better future, blending with Europe, and then the books where it's actually a debate of who are these Jews? Do we actually come from the ancient Israelites, or are we a European people who just follow the Jewish religion? And there were actually Jews and non-Jews on both sides of the issue for really over 1,000 years. And then, sometimes divided, because Jews have a mixed, there's Jews of all different types, but because there's a significant population of light-featured Jews, that a person could know, their fellow Jew, and this would have been Europe at the time, and said like, oh, the Jews are just like us. They're basically us who follows a different philosophy, a different religion, as opposed to, maybe Jews, the majority of Jews who are darker featured, who be like, oh, the Jews just aren't different in following a different religion. They're actually a foreign people and different people that, I mean, I could go on. There's an interesting literature. I forward you some of the books and the articles and some of the texts, like, even from the Talmud to the sages. And I don't think the Talmud and the sages are per se racist, but almost all of them for the last 1,000 years do echo this theological concept that dark skin is caused by sin, and a warning to people that don't become a sinner or your skin will turn darker, that appears in Rashi. I think it's even in the Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah, so was there much significant difference between early Jewish and Christian views of blacks?
My guess is that if you look at the north-south divide as the lighter, darker divide, in some ancient times, that basically south meant darker, north meant lighter. That in the biblical period, almost all of the dealings of Israel was with darker skinned people, and at the close, Persia and Assyria and all the Middle Eastern tribes, that Greece is already post closing of the biblical canon, and even Greece and Rome are Mediterranean people that, so to say, are only slightly whiter than Israel. So I think in ancient times there would have been no reason to assume anything like white supremacy. It's possible in ancient times that there would have been a sexual selection where blue-eyed people are pretty, but I assume in ancient Jerusalem, anyone who studied the Talmud knows that like the people who wrote the Talmud were slave traders. God forbid. But in ancient Jerusalem, there was probably an open slave market, and very likely an African slave in ancient Jerusalem was more valuable than a European slave, and there would have been no reason at all to have had a colorism in the ancient times. And the Jews, we probably see ourselves as like a middle ground, not too light, not too dark, not too much renunciation, not too much indulgement, and so on and so on. But through the diaspora, when the center of world power and the center of Jewish power shifts to Europe, that there's convergence in Jewish thought, Jewish literature, and Jewish history to becoming a European people, and through probably selective breeding practices and eventually eugenics. And interesting, I mean, anybody who knows eugenics, God forbid, like breeding for intelligence, probably the most common aspect of eugenics is breeding for lighter features. And, think that Europeans, I was talking with Gandalf and Church of Entropy about this last night on Week in Review, that if you say Europeans are Europeans because they're adapted to the environment, as we're Jews, we're not adapted to the environment. We're adapted to the people who are adapted to that environment. And so I was reading this book, Morris Fishberg, and he's even got it was written 100 years ago. And he's got skull measurements and pictures from all over the world, and all these statistical measurements of various peoples. And it was interesting that they did these studies 100 years ago, and they measured all these things like eye complexion, skin tone, hair color, skull shape, height, and these various factors. But says that Jews, even become light features, generally have the same, I guess we call skull type and body structure as other Ashkenazic Jews. It's just they're phenotypically lighter, although that's not always the case. And I'm not sure, are you familiar with this literature? And it's interesting because it was Jewish organizations that sanctioned this literature, and they actually studied, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of Jews.
I have some acquaintance, so not deep learning, but I've read some of it. Out of everything you've read on this topic, which books, which authors, or which essays particularly stood out to you?
This guy, I think his name is John Glad. I forwarded you a copy of his book on Jewish eugenics, and it had a timeline, and he was like a modern day eugenicist that was trying to defend the movement from, so to say, the Nazi vilification. And, it's related, God forbid, to the article and the topic of the show in terms of selection pressure and racism, white privilege in general, that, I was saying to Jennifer's, is pretty blue eyes racist? And is it, racist to say, I want to marry a blonde? And if you say historically, like in Hollywood, the gentlemen prefer blondes, it's like, no, racists prefer blondes. And in terms of the selection pressure, you could you see that's probably the direction that at least the pushing of culture is going, and the internet and technology will make it more measurable. So if you say no, it's really, there's a natural human tendency to behave this way, but it's bad, and we got to use technology and society to prevent people from behaving the way that they naturally want to behave. God forbid that could be the case, or that they think that it's really not natural to behave this way. There's some sort of historical anomaly that for some reason, people mistakenly confused light for good and dark for bad, which has absolutely no accuracy, no truth to it. But for over 1,000 years, on huge parts of the world, there have been this confusion factor of conflating light with good and dark with bad that pervades human society so much that now dating apps are not even going to let you see the color of the person you're dating because the implicit bias is so much.
And how did you like the book, The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam?
I mean, unfortunately, none of these books kind of own that like we were probably a slave trading society. So it's a good book. There's a lot of scholarship. It was interesting, just going over the history of these topics and the sources and even the slave trade. But it's hard to be an apologetic, not to be an apologetic. And we're to say that in ancient Israel, we were unapologetic slave traders. That was the way we believe society should be structured at the time. And if you're going to claim like a racism type thing, that like we were unapologetically in the ancient times believers, at least in some extent, to the system of slavery, but slavery had nothing to do with race. It was, either just the fact of losing in war or not being able to pay a person's debt or being caught for a crime. And, whatever the case, that had absolutely nothing to do with race. And it was a perversion brought in from, there's a lot of the Islamic shifts. So I even met Edwin Black when he came to Detroit in his books, and he does kind of the Islamic shift on slavery. And, but I mean, then you take a critical approach at Judaism, and it is probably good for us. It's probably important for Jews to recognize the truth of the history. And like, if you study the text, you can't really argue with it, because like you've studied Talmud, and it's saying like, isn't it pretty obvious that the people who wrote the Talmud were slave traders? If not like the rabbis, but like in general, that they were, them or their associates were blatantly slave traders.
Yes. I mean, Jews, along with other Europeans, were trading slaves up until the 19th century. How did Jen and Gandalf react to your points?
I think, I guess Jennifer having darker features and being confused for being Jewish, and I guess her mother's a blue-eyed woman, so she's pretty familiar with this, and maybe due to circumstance, she's been in scenarios where it's really, really white. Like generally, I'm in a pretty diverse place, so very rarely am I around all white people. Maybe like a few times I traveled a few hours to like an engineering conference, and basically, like everybody had blue eyes, but even everybody being white is a rare occurrence. Like maybe even only a few times a year. Not including like synagogue and Ashkenazic Jews. But yeah, I would guess it may not even happen like the whole year, where I'm going to be in a circumstance where I'm at a place where everybody's white. But I assume Jennifer, due to circumstance, location where she lives, she's probably basically around mostly white people. And Gandalf, probably also diverse. He's probably a little bit more race conscious than Jennifer, but he probably also has never been around all white people. Like maybe recently, if he got into the alt-right and started traveling, but Gandalf probably has never been where there's all white people. Maybe he had like a group of 3, 5, 8 friends, but like no, I don't even think like I've even had like a clique of 3, 5, like 10 friends. Like I just live in such diverse places that, or you don't experience it like that. Even though you live in diverse places, you still have like cliques of white people.
Yeah, I've got cliques of white people. I mean, white people tend to dominate elite society, from Los Angeles to San Francisco to New York to Washington, D.C. Now, which racial groups do you feel the most comfortable around?
Well, we discussed this. I feel generally comfortable around everybody, especially if there's a purpose to what I'm doing. If I'm around for no reason, there might be varying safety, comfortability levels, like traveling, historical experience. But no, I'm pretty comfortable dealing with any people, as long as there's a purpose to it. So if it was business or education or governmental, it doesn't really matter to me, who I'm dealing with.
Right. And how have you been dealing with the pandemic and any lockdown? Is that still going on in Detroit?
Yeah, cases have been hovering around 1,000 a day, slightly over. Deaths are back down to in the tens. So like they're trying to get schools. I don't know if schools are open back or they're trying to get them back open. It's pretty cold. There was like a foot of snow. It's starting to melt. So probably in about 2 weeks, when the temperatures warmed up a little bit, there'll be a push to reopen up schools and dining and various things, and we'll see if there's another surge or wave. So right now, yeah, it's basically just, let's wait another 2 weeks till it gets warmer. I was speaking with Gandalf and Charles Moskowitz about the Texas power outage and the Edward Dutton and the reverse Flynn effect, and I think incompetence is going to become a huge factor, and unfortunately we might see that there's going to be huge failings across sectors of society. It's been like a year and I haven't been to anything, but like I used to go to engineering conferences and to university and different trade shows, and many good engineers. Like we're already bringing in people from around the world to fulfill our engineering jobs, and so the infrastructure around us is already basically ran by Indians and foreigners. That God forbid we could be in a real competency crisis.
And how are you dealing with the pandemic and the lockdown yourself? How's your health, mental, physical?
Thank God, I think I'm fine. Like, I'm still doing what I'm doing. I got my eBay business, stream a little bit. I'm not making any moves. Like I'm not looking at any properties or, trying to make any deals. I probably could. So I'm just basically waiting, and I could probably wait another year, God forbid. Like, I don't want to wait another year, but I could probably handle this, another year, just catch up more in my reading, think about some more things, play some chess. So, I mean, God forbid that's not, I'd like to, so to say, get back to doing things, but I think there's going to be a real assessment, after a year of shutdown. There's probably going to be severe economic austerity coming. Biden coming like, oh, we're going to invest in America's back, that we got Trump out of office. I would not buy that at all. I would say no one is going to take the U.S. that seriously on the international stage. Not that seriously, but definitely less serious than they've ever taken us. The U.S. is going to be taken less seriously than we've been taken, at least in decades. And economically, I mean, it's unclear what's going to happen. Saying if we could still keep on pumping out products and, we're going to have Amazon delivering us food or, products, and I'm going to be able to maintain my suburban lifestyle and car and, do a little bit here and there. But, who knows, what Purim's coming up. Different synagogues are doing different things. I guess some are almost already back to normal, and some are, trying masks and social distancing. Probably the more orthodox might be somewhat back to normal. People who've already been infected, smaller numbers, but probably not that many masks. And the modern Orthodox are probably trying their best with masks and social distancing outdoors if possible, but it's too cold here. I don't think anyone's really doing that much outdoors. And the more secular Jews are probably still doing Zoom and not publicly meeting. But when we're, so to say, back to normal and we're meeting face to face again, there's probably going to be an assessment, and you're going to see, God forbid, a lot of people died, a lot of organizations went bankrupt, a lot of newspapers, went under, and we'll see, what's the assessment, who's still standing, who was rich before the pandemic, that's now poor, God forbid, in these various factors. So it'll be interesting, what kind of realignment happens as we open up.
And what have you been talking about with Charles Moskowitz?
When we talked last week about eugenics, and we talked about reincarnation. Since Trump, he was really pushing for Trump till the last minute, like till January 6th. he was full pushing for Trump, and maybe even after January 6th, like he wasn't going to support the insurrection, God forbid anything like that, but he was still kind of like pushing for Trump up to inauguration somewhat. But after inauguration, we went back to just discussing more intellectual, historic topics. And a lot of weeks now, we don't even talk about politics. So, although, what do you think about the reverse Flynn effect and possible, the possibility that we are less intelligent than we were decades ago, and it's going to be problematic because the infrastructure of society is not going to be able to be operated because we're not smart enough to. So bringing over foreigners who are smarter than us might work for a generation, but is it going to come collapsing down? You think the reverse Flynn effect is true?
Yes, I believe it's clear that we're becoming less intelligent since about the Industrial Revolution. So uniformly around the West since about 1850. So the Flynn effect is not primarily with regard to general intelligence. It's primarily to do with less G weighted aspects of IQ testing. So yeah, to me, it's pretty clear that with each generation going by, we're becoming less intelligent because we've created incentives where less intelligent people are incentivized to have more children than more intelligent people are incentivized. But I don't think society is going to crumble in the next 50 years. I think we'll still muddle through. But this general decline in intelligence is a serious matter. And I don't see anything wrong with the concept of eugenics. Simply means that people prefer to mate with those with whom they'll have the best kids. So if you take care with who you mate with and who you have children with, you're practicing eugenics. Now, obviously, you can practice eugenics in a horrible way, whereby you euthanize people. So obviously, that's horrible. But simply taking care with who you select as a spouse and as the future mother or father of your children, to me, that seems admirable.
Yeah, but there's a lot of misunderstanding around the concept, but the pushback of what is white privilege and racism, and say like no, even what was considered common sense in breeding, because racism's become such a high crime that you'd be like, no, you can't really say like I want a white girlfriend, that's racist, and even though there's going to be repercussions for even thinking that way, and God forbid that would be the direction. I mentioned to Gandalf last night an interesting idea about the problem of competency, because the structure here in the U.S. is that if you have a high level of competency, generally you're just going to sell your service to the highest bidder, because you're going to need clients, and generally the push will be to sell your service to the highest bidder, and that tends towards corruption, because a lot of times the people who are paying the most competent people the highest price want them to bend the rules in their favor in a corrupt way. So the most competent people use their expertise to corrupt the system, and then the lower competency people that don't really have services to sell at high levels on the open market, those are the people that end up working for the government. And at this point, it doesn't have to be catastrophic, but it's an interesting. You agree with that mechanic, that's kind of how things operate. That you're doing Alexander technique, and if you're really good at it, end of the day, you're going to end up selling your service to the highest bidder, because that's the way capitalism works.
Yes, and people who eventually can't take care of themselves, or they can barely scrape by, then will have either universal basic income or just the welfare system to take care of them.
Yeah, I guess saying it's not your low level person. Like I'm saying, the person who finishes top in the class, maybe could sell their service to the open market, the person who is an average person in the class could go on to work for the government. So, someone who doesn't even go to school is going to be on UBI. And actually, I'm not that catastrophic. Like Andrew Yang, I mentioned he chose a Hasidic Jewish liaison that I know. He might win, and that's the way things work. God forbid, like UBI, it could be first tested among like Hasidim in New York. The first people in the world, to have the UBI is going to be like Hasidim in Brooklyn. But like, who knows? That's how things work sometimes. So I wouldn't be surprised if Andrew Yang looks like he's in good standing to win New York mayor, and there could be a push and just to try UBI, and there could be the competency problem is somewhat solvable because the mechanized age is that it takes fewer and fewer people to run the system, and even if those people reap an unusual reward, and even if the amount of intelligent people producing intelligent children is decreasing, the actual number of intelligent people required to run the system may be decreasing. And then you mentioned also the infrastructure, that probably the infrastructure in the U.S. needs to be replaced, that we can't just keep on fixing it. And, if you follow technology, there's a lot of things that are changing, like gas to maybe electric, or driver to driverless cars. And that might change the way cities are laid out, and highways and various things. And it could be the U.S. does really need a reset. God forbid, like Japan after World War II, where they were able to create new infrastructure. But the U.S., like, our infrastructure is horrible. Trump, the only reason I kind of liked Trump when he was running was because he was a builder, that maybe he'll actually fix the infrastructure, which he really didn't do anything about. And our infrastructure is really at dire levels. People should know in America, and it's like, I studied to be a civil engineer. Largely the reason I became against representational democracy was because of engineering and lobbying, where it's like, as a Jew, we're familiar with all the things we lobby politicians about, but there's a lot of engineering things that are really just beyond the capability of our politicians' understanding. So it's simply like, oh, Israel, Palestine, and the ICC, but something like the energy grid, and you're watching, the New York Times is blaming it on the Republicans and this and that, but none of these politicians really are engineers or understand this stuff, and even the financial sector. So I don't know about you, but like, I don't see the federal government lasting, and like, not like in a catastrophe way, but yeah, I think the system's broken, and there is going to be no way to bandage it up. What does that mean? Like, does the currency collapse? Is there a new government? Is there balkanization? Not necessarily. It could be that you will be able to regroup together something, but I mean, I don't know. You're following the politics. You see Biden. I don't think he's going to accomplish anything. Like, they're not going to really be able to pass any legislation. All they're really doing right now is begging to give away money. And if they succeed, it's probably, like, I don't know, like, I mean, you let me ramble on your channel, I guess, but that's about it.
Yeah, I think the United States is going to hold together. I don't see secession or disaster coming soon. Now, I definitely don't believe most people are equipped to work for themselves. I think 95% of people are far better off working for someone else. So it seems like every smart person has dreams about, what they'd like to be doing, and it's always something prestigious, right? They'd like to own their own company, their own small business, be a live streamer, or host a radio talk show, or be an actor, or start their own nonprofit. So it seems like every smart person has a dream, but usually that dream isn't simply being a worker among workers, and yet very few people are equipped to successfully run their own businesses. And according to JP Morgan, I think it was back in 2016, they stated that the average small business only has 27 days of cash reserves on hand. which does not seem serious to me. I mean, a serious individual should have at least 3 months of cash reserves on hand. But would you agree with me that 95% of people are simply not cut out to run their own businesses as their primary source of income?
Yeah, I mean, you could even say a certain percentage of people, if it's 75%, are really not capable of taking their own life into their own hands. Running a business might be a higher level than, just taking your life into your own hands, but, being responsible for themselves, not needing people to take care of them. And I'm not, I still need my mom and people to help me out with basic things. My mom is like renewing my license plate now. I could probably figure that out or do it, but I still got my mom doing that for me. I'm a grown man. I mentioned also yesterday, I know a lot of Indians, and used to go to Hindu temples all the time, and I used to joke with people, but the system, it's like, okay, maybe people like you, maybe they don't. Maybe people are racist and they don't really like you and they don't want you here. But this is America, and if you have the skill, you have your job, and you're going to get a check, and then you could do whatever you want with that money. And I mean, so I guess a lot of people, they didn't know that, like, I guess they were scared. They didn't know that, like, yes, like, you got paid, you could do whatever you want with that money. And I remember, like, the first time I was day trading, I made, I hadn't gotten paid in like months, and I was broke and like really bad financial situation. And then all of a sudden I made like $10,000 in one day. And it was like, it was real money. It was like, you want a check? That's real money. You want me to give you a check? And, just cut me out. I got me a few $1,000s the first time in my life I'd ever made more than, tens of dollars an hour. But for the American, if you're an expert engineer coming to America to maintain our infrastructure or provide expertise in things that unfortunately we no longer have expertise for ourselves in, they do get that check, and they can do whatever they want with it within American society. And that's, probably, you in Hollywood and, God forbid, the pornography business and things like that. That's probably a driving fuel behind that, is like, it doesn't matter whether you like me or not. I could fulfill my function, I could get my check, and I could do whatever I want with that money, even if no one likes me.
Yeah. Okay, we got an interesting story here from Canada. Canada charges a political party's leader with promoting anti-Semitism. The leader of a far-right political party in Canada has been arrested and charged with willfully promoting hatred against Jews, reportedly a first for a Canadian political party. I don't think you could get arrested for promoting hatred in the United States. So this guy's 29 years of age. Travis Patron is his name, and his arrest stems from a 2019 social network video called Beware the Parasitic Tribe. The news report said cast Jews as swindlers and snakes, and Patron has a social media history of denying the Holocaust. So in many countries, denying the Holocaust is a crime. He claimed that Jewish people infiltrate the media, they hijack the central bank, they infect the body politic like a parasite. What we need to do is remove these people once and for all from our country. So Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center filed an official complaint against Patron with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Saskatchewan Attorney General. Patron founded the Canadian Nationalist Party more than 3 years ago, and he's scheduled to appear in court March 11. He might get 2 years in prison. Any thoughts on this story, David?
Yeah, God forbid. I mean, I saw that. I think that guy John Vance, who was on my channel, maybe on your channel a few times, who ironically was the first person that Claire got to take secular Quranism seriously, and then went on to mainstream Islam. But I think he was associated with that party, and he even came on like my channel and Week in Review promoting it and arguing on behalf of those ideas until Claire converted him to Islam. But you related to the incompetence is, if you don't think the Democrats are really going to be able to successfully govern, they might have somewhat of an agenda, but it's really unclear whether they even have an agenda and they're going to be able to accomplish anything but it is America, and we do have the spoil system, and they will use the full force of the government to go after their enemies. And, that could be in Canada or the US. And, whether we're going to get our $1,400 check or not, maybe not. But, that the federal government will use its full force to go after, who it considers bad actors is almost a guarantee. I mean, right? And even social media that they're likely to collude, that social media and the Democrats, at least for the next few months, are likely to just collude and go after their enemies. And, the general population right now, it's like, okay, like you said, you were going to do all these things. So it just can be like, wait, let us keep on going after our enemies. And then, maybe like if the U.S. system works like it usually does, like 6 months from now, there'll be like enough public pressure or, some like senatorial thing or something that could shift the balance of power that will cause the Democrats to, lighten up a little bit. It's like Richard Spencer, now he's a Democrat. He supported Biden. And was it because he was serious, or was it because he was scared for his life? He saw that he was scared, at the end of the day, that he didn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to have his life ruined by defending these ideas and against his attackers in court cases the rest of his life. And he probably saw to it like, yes, there are these organizations and they are going to try to ruin his life. Possibly even though he repented, they might still try to ruin his life the rest of his life. But certainly had he not, and even like you yourself, to say like, I saw you play that Brundle clips the other day, that the reason the Luke Ford show changed so much, the biggest factor was probably YouTube cracking down and policy. That there's a bunch of factors like co-host and this and that, but in terms of the direction of your show, probably the biggest factor was YouTube's changing rules for what's allowable content.
Yeah, I mean, think about the dramatic difference between the way Richard Spencer speaks now compared to 3 years ago. Think about the dramatic difference all sorts of people on the alt-right, the way they conduct themselves and speak now compared to just 3 years ago. They've overall, most of the major alt-right figures, they have deliberately turned themselves down to become much more socially acceptable, and probably in large part it's to stay on social media. And also just the consequences outside of social media just being in the real world. Their real world consequences now much more dramatic and immediate than they were 3 years ago. And so all throughout the distant right, people are turning it down.
Yeah, unless it gets, God forbid, to a point where life has been, where it backfires, like Israel and Palestine or something like that, where, obviously Israel has been, trying to ruin the lives of our enemies for decades. But at a certain point, there's hundreds of thousands of people on those lists. And even though they're living in refugee camps and, God forbid, becoming terrorists, and in America, that could happen to a certain extent, like just the numbers of the ADL and the people willing to, so to say, take that hit, even though let's say the Democratic Party, the government, and social media are going to collude to try to ruin the lives of these people. But at some point, human spirit can't be beaten into submission, and the fact that they ruin people's lives like that might cause more people to become sympathetic to it, and it caused a multiplication level. And I think that the U.S. political system, like a sine wave of balance of power, is probably supposed to work that way. That the spoils system, like, yes, of course, the Democrats are going to appoint their attorney generals and all their executive orders and try to ruin the lives of all of their enemies. But after a few months, the balance of power will start to check back a little bit, and they'll say like, well, you can only carry this so far. Maybe a few hundred people they're going to, it's like Merrick Garland. God forbid, all of the things facing the U.S. and his main concern is going after the Capitol rioters. And how long could they keep this going? It's like they might keep it going for 2 years. It could be that nothing will get done. In 2 years from now, they're still going to be telling you about everything they're doing to try to put these people in prison.
Yeah. And how's the burning flame of your Yiddishkeit? Because Orthodox Judaism is very much centered around social interactions, gathering with people for meals, gathering together at the synagogue, celebrating, mourning together. You do pretty much everything together in a traditional Jewish life. And it's very weird to be separated from the community. So how's the burning flame of your Yiddishkeit dealing with this almost a year now of social isolation?
Actually, pretty fine, because I was kind of always an individualist, and I was kind of always a God guy. Like I was like talking to Hashem and like Breslov, he's Voididus, and I used to like tishes and nice davening, but here in Detroit there's not really Hasidim like that. So I've been holding strong, like at least on a certain level observance, like Sabbath, I chant all the prayers, say Kriya Shema every day. I've been learning Kabbalah, but I still look in the mirror and just see a Jew. I don't think that's going to change any time in my life. And maybe it was the opposite for me, where I kind of recognized, like, I'm not really part of the Jewish community. Like, I'm part of the Jewish community. I go to events. I know thousands of Jews, but like, I'm not really part of the community. And in the essence, I'm somewhat non-sectarian. That although like I go to Minyan, and I know lots of Jews, and I'm concerned with Israel and various things that affect the Jewish community. In essence, I'm egalitarian and try to treat Jews and non-Jews the same. And, especially being that I come from a mixed family and have Jews and non-Jews in my family. So, it's pretty impractical to treat Jews and non-Jews differently. So I've made the point of trying to be consistent, like that. So like, obviously I'm not going to try to rally up a bunch of goyim for a minyan or that, but so in that aspect, that probably alienated me from the community at large, because presumably Jews have a larger distinction and like feel like we do treat the in-group differently, so to say, the out-group. But because of that, honestly, like I could do another year like this. Like, thank God, like I'm not a violent person, I'm not a criminal, like I don't need to be in prison, but like like no problem, like I just sit and read, and like really I could do another year like this. I don't think it'd bother me. I mean, the only thing that bothers me is like I guess the loneliness, that I feel like I'm missing out on finding the right woman and having children. And maybe if I had children, I'd be more concerned about my children being part of the community, but I don't think so. Actually, I think if I found the right woman and had children, I don't think I'd be that concerned that my children were even part of a greater community. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I definitely want my children to be part of a greater community. Now, I'm thinking, I desperately miss being part of the community and gathering with people for meals and for prayer and for the social and for the study of Torah together. But on the other hand, I've enjoyed the extra time that I've had to read. So I look forward to getting back into the community, and I've made good use of my year away from the community, just reading a lot of books. Thinking back to something we were talking about previously, given the success of getting people like Richard Spencer to tone down. So social media companies, by becoming more restrictive with their terms of service, they've gotten dozens of dissident right personalities to completely tone down the things that they say publicly. And given the effectiveness, say, of the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center in going after racists, maybe Dooovid, the pro-censorship crowd, knows what they're doing, and they're very good at it.
Well, yeah, I didn't say that. I mean, it's. I mean, when I spoke on Root and Branch in Jerusalem, I mentioned University of Michigan, where for like 10 years straight, the Palestinian student group tried to bring a BDS measure, and it finally passed when the year before they, so to say, doxed everybody who showed any bit of support for it on Canary's mission. And then the next year they did secret ballot and passed the BDS measure that to a certain extent it works, and to a certain extent it doesn't. And to the extent it doesn't, it's probably more likely to cause a larger future adverse reaction. But like, yes, certainly having lists to just inform people that, these people are bad and problematic, and even, kind of like a wanted poster, like, if you want to ruin some, bad people's life, here's some pretty bad people that we recommend. And then even having well-funded organizations that keep track of these people and say the government may not have cracked down on you, but we're going to keep at you. We're going to, even pay people to monitor you. We're going to have these lists out, and we're going to have paid people that are going to call your places of employment and your family and tell them that you're bad, and then add on to that we're going to seek power from the government, and now that we won, we're going to use the full force of the government against you also. And so say like, yeah, that's like you turned Richard Spencer from God forbid, like a borderline neo-Nazi to Biden supporter, and his thing is probably the fear factor, because he's looking at like, does he really want to risk going to prison and having his life ruined for them, when he looks at who's supporting him, and he sees that these law cases are going against him, and the judge doesn't appear to be on his side, and all the people that he thinks, I mean, God forbid, I knew some pretty harsh people, and just say like, you get in trouble, you're saying, don't think any of these people are going to be able to help you. You're saying you get arrested, and I don't know, like you're in LA, there's probably prison chaplains or something like that. But in New York, there's some rabbis that are pretty powerful and might be able to get you out of prison, but your average rabbi can't do anything for you. And and I was saying, like a rabbi, if you're just like a goy who was trolling somebody's YouTube, and now you got a case on you got the FBI looking after you, and you're facing possible prison time, it's like, who are you going to call for help? And there might not really be anybody out there. And God forbid, like the Holocaust, World War II, you think, was it a extreme backlash? You think like, we won, we got them, we got these guys scared, they're running in their boots, like even Richard Spencer repented. Every single person on the alt-right, they're kicked off YouTube, they're scared to show their face because we're going to send the FBI to their house, and Biden's gonna, and Merrick Garland's gonna put a case on them. But I'm skeptical how well that strategy is going to work, and I would expect human nature, it's going to backfire, and it could become like Palestine in America, where the power of the computer and technology, and I never liked that strategy in Israel, where it's just like, yeah, they're going to try to keep on killing us, and we're going to keep on catching them, and that's not really the way I want to live my life. And if you're a liberal, like a multicultural liberal in a Biden organization, you could see that's the way it's going to come. You're saying like, God forbid, these people want to kill me, but I'm going to trust in this system that we're going to keep on catching them, and keep on putting them on these lists, and keep on ruining their lives and scaring them into submission.
And the chat says, yeah, I mean, Richard Spencer is one case, but what about the rest of them? Mike Enoch, Eric Stryker, even Nick Fuentes haven't changed tune at all. I would strongly disagree with you. I think all of these people, Mike Enoch, Eric Stryker, and Nick Fuentes, have significantly toned things down over the past 3 years. The Right Stuff crowd significantly toned things down over the past 3 years. Okay, Dooovid, any final words for today?
Yeah, interesting talking. And if you did want to read or do a deep dive into kind of like a historical eugenics or a modern day eugenics. I thought that it was a pretty interesting topic, and even like the demography of the Jewish community 100 years ago. But it was not a big deal. So
yeah, no, I'm
just
definitely interested. So it's definitely on my list of things to read and discuss further with you.
okay, great. And I still have on my desk the Mark Shapiro, The Limits of Orthodox Theology. If you ever did want to finish that, but I'm reading these books on eugenics because they're interesting. And I think you're going to see there is going to be probably a push for mandatory Holocaust education, and you might see a venue, and it's probably going to be weird because like there's going to be a lot of talk about the Holocaust, but like they're not going to want me or you talking, like so it's going to be pretty weird. I mean, I don't know, we can talk about that at a different time also, but I assume you agree with me that all of my local Congress people, part of their platform is like federal mandatory Holocaust education. But at the same time, it doesn't really make sense because it's like we're not allowed to talk about it, but we're supposed to talk about it. So it'll be interesting.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Dooovid. Good to talk to you, man.
You too. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Take care. All right. Let's have a look here and see what Tucker Carlson's talking about.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight you've heard the name Naomi Wolf before. She's been a prominent person in this country and a prominent Democrat for more than 30 years. Wolf is one of the founders of third wave feminism. She worked for Bill Clinton. She advised Al Gore famously. Late last year she voted for Joe Biden. You've almost certainly seen her books. She's written a lot of them. A couple years ago we criticized Naomi Wolf by name on the show. We didn't think we agreed on much, to put it mildly. Yet less than a week after the last election, Wolf surprised a lot of people by tweeting this, quote, "If I'd known Biden was open to lockdowns, as he now states, which is something historically unprecedented in any pandemic, and a terrifying practice, one that won't ever end because elites love it, I would never have voted for him." Wow, where'd that come from? And more to the point, how did a faithful, lifelong Democrat reach that conclusion? Maybe because whatever her preconceptions, Naomi Wolf has been paying attention. And that's true for a lot of us, actually, regardless of who we voted for. People who've been watching carefully may find they have very different views than the views they once had. And the reason for that is simple. Reality itself is changing very fast. All over the world, countries that once seemed like bulwarks of traditional liberal values, freedom of assembly, property rights, freedom of speech, and conscience, have suddenly abandoned their long-standing traditions of protecting the individual and now resemble police states. It's not an overstatement. The change has been sudden and it's been dramatic. And the pretext for it, of course, has been COVID. Consider Canada, our sprawling, ice-covered neighbor to the north. Not so long ago, Canada was considered such a stable and restrained place that its main problem was being uninteresting. Nothing seemed to happen there. The great white waste of time, they called it. Not anymore. Since COVID arrived, the Canadian authorities bear no resemblance to the taciturn Mounties you may remember. They act like Burmese generals putting down a coup. Nothing is too harsh for their own citizens. This footage, for example, was shot New Year's Eve in the Canadian city of Gatineau. A group of friends gathered in a private home. No one was selling fentanyl, no one plotting a homicide. Just a group of relentlessly polite Canadians celebrating the New Year. Apparently somebody called the police, and here's what happened next. That's pretty shocking. But what happened after that may be worse than the footage you just saw. The police fined everyone at the gathering $1,500 apiece, and then they arrested the owner of the home. Now, he wasn't charged with attacking a cop or spreading COVID, which no one claimed he did. No. His crime was described as, quote, refusing to provide personal information to the authorities. So they barged into his home, and when he didn't answer the right questions quickly enough, they arrested him. Now, that is not a public health measure. It is intentional humiliation. But the humiliation didn't stop there. You may have noticed that some of the police officers you just saw in that video were not wearing masks themselves. So in other words, the cops who claimed the people inside were violating corona law were themselves in violation of it. When sharp-eyed people on social media pointed this out, the police in Gatineau explained they didn't have to follow public health laws because it was a public health emergency. So just to show you how serious they are about stopping COVID, Canadian police were willing to spread COVID themselves. That's what they said. Canada's so-called Liberal Party didn't have a problem with any of this, neither did the supposedly liberal Prime Minister. No one in Canada seemed to. And not just Canada. The entire Anglosphere is moving toward authoritarianism that nobody seems to be noticing. In the formerly free UK last weekend, a group of people in West Midlands created what authorities later described as, and if you've got kids, I don't want to warn you, this could be shocking, a, quote, makeshift club with a bar, VIP area, and a dance room with a DJ. Yes, a DJ. So naturally, the authorities sprang into action. They dispatched a thermal imaging helicopter. They kicked down doors. It was a threat worse than ISIS, and they acted like it. Police! Nobody move! Police! Get your no job! No job! No job! What's the potato? Stay where you are! Stay where you are! Everybody stay where you are! Stay where you are, get there! Stay there! Everybody keep calm! Everybody, stay calm! Stay where you are! Do we say this was happening just in the Anglosphere? No, if only. A similar scene played out in Madrid this weekend. You're seeing the images right now. A police raid on an unauthorized party forced the people inside into closets and cupboards, hiding under mattresses. Madrid's police later released a statement admonishing residents, quote, "We keep asking you for collaboration and responsibility." Now, even allowing for the translation from the Spanish, that is Orwellian, but it probably no longer shocks you. You've been living with less dramatic versions of this for nearly a year. There may be less door kicking going on in this country, but the result is the same. Traumatized citizens and destroyed lives. Listen to this gym owner in San Francisco explain what has happened to her livelihood under the lockdown regime.
Danielle Rapkin owns CrossFit Golden Gate. She's in a lot of debt.
I've been a business owner for 8.5 years. I've been running this business. It's been leveled to the ground. I've actually thought about leaving the city. I'm watching the city burn to the ground. I'm watching all of my members leave. I don't have much of a reason to stay anymore. My business has been completely decimated. Show me the data, the contact tracing data that shows transmission is happening there, and then I will close my doors. Until then, let me earn a living.
Danielle Rapkin, just an American citizen, nobody cares what she thinks. Let me earn a living, she says. That used to resonate. The ability to work was once considered a human right, one of the most basic human rights, but then a lot of things were once considered basic human rights. Remember, my body, my choice? You've heard people chant that for 50 years. As recently as 2019, Kamala Harris endorsed that idea.
Women have been given the responsibility to perpetuate the human species. Our bodies were created to do that. And it does not give any other person the right to tell a woman what to do with that body. It is her body. It is her right. It is her decision.
Yeah, it's your body. It's your right. Oh, sorry, COVID. Actually, it's Bill Gates' body now. Bill Gates isn't God, just a big shareholder in Microsoft. But since COVID, Bill Gates has gained extraordinary powers over what you can and cannot do to your own body. Bill Gates would like you to take the coronavirus vaccine. That's not a request. If you don't comply, you could lose your job. Think we're exaggerating? Listen to this waitress from Brooklyn.
The 34-year-old says she was fired after telling her employer she and her husband are considering starting a family, and she had hesitations about getting the COVID-19 vaccine.
What's your biggest reservation about getting the vaccine? I just need more time. I need more research to come out, and I have my reservations about fertility.
Jacobson says the restaurant, Red Hook Tavern, sent out an email requiring all staff to get vaccinated now that they're eligible in New York. When she pushed back, she says she received an email terminating her employment.
Do you think it's fair for a workplace to be able to determine whether or not its employees should be vaccinated? I don't.
You heard what she said. She's not a crazy person. She's not a denier. I'd like more evidence. I'd like more research to come out. She's got questions about the vaccine. A vaccine was produced faster than any other vaccine in history. But if you have those questions, you can have a job. Now, once again, to be totally clear, we're not talking about what they deride as vaccine denial, anti-vaxxer. The woman you just saw says she supports vaccines. And by the way, most people do support vaccines because they've saved more lives than any other advance in science. But even the good vaccines can have side effects. And it's fair to ask what those side effects might be. Why wouldn't it be fair to ask that? Just days ago, the New York Times reported that, quote, a few COVID vaccine recipients developed a rare blood disorder. A link to the vaccines is not certain, and investigations are underway in some reported cases. Okay. So let's say you wanted to wait for the results of those investigations you read about in the New York Times. Sound fair? No, you can't. Sorry. You lose your job for that. You might lose your right to travel within this country, the one you were born in. In a moment like this, where things are moving so quickly in a dark direction, you've got to wonder, where are all the liberals? Where are our leaders, the people we elect to protect us from irrational and destructive overreach like what we're seeing now? Those people are gone. They've ceded all authority to those who describe themselves as scientists. Joe Biden admitted this out loud in August. Watch.
If you're sworn in come January and we have coronavirus and the flu combining, which many scientists have said is a real possibility, would you be prepared to shut this country down again?
I would be prepared to do whatever it takes to save lives, because we cannot get the country moving until we control the virus.
If the scientists say shut it down?
I would shut it down. I would listen to the scientists.
Now, you thought the voters were in charge of the country, speaking through their elected leaders. That's why we have elections. But that's not true. The scientists are in charge. I would listen to the scientists. And Biden's not the only one who says this. This is a staple of our public conversation these days. So what are the scientists saying? Well, yesterday, the most scientific of all the scientists, the supremely science-based Dr. Anthony Fauci, told us we could all be wearing masks in 2022. This was a surprise. You thought the vaccine meant your life could return to normal. No, according to Tony Fauci, you thought wrong. Things are never getting back to normal.
You and the president have suggested that we'll approach normality toward the end of the year. What does normal mean? Do you think Americans will still be wearing masks, for example, in 2022?
You know, I think it is possible that that's the case. And again, it really depends on what you mean by normality. If normality means exactly the way things were before we had this happen to us, I mean, I can't predict that.
Oh, I can't predict that, if it means returning to the life you love. So what can Dr. Fauci predict? Well, we don't need masks, he told us. Then he said we do need masks. Actually, probably need 2 masks, maybe 3. And in fact, we might need those masks forever. Those are some of Tony Fauci's many predictions. We showed you his greatest hits before on the show. We're not going to wreck your night with it again. But the question is, and we should be thinking about this, what effect will this current suspension of our Bill of Rights have on American society over time? What kind of country will your grandkids live in? Is anyone even asking that question? No, not anymore, because questions are disloyal. If you believe in science, simply obey. Meanwhile, the costs amount, the real ones, measurable. Bankruptcies, addictions, suicides. So what will the country look like when it's over? Well, it could be dirtier for sure, the environment. Here's one unintended consequence of the lockdown regime that absolutely nobody is talking about: the degradation of our natural environment.
Odds are, over the past several months of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, you've seen a mask or 2 on the ground. The Chattahoochee riverkeeper, Jason Olseth, says he's never seen the river filled with so much plastic. And we're not just talking about water bottles and food containers.
We've actually pulled over 2 million pounds of trash out of the river system, and gloves and masks have not been something we've seen in the past.
So where are all the people who care about nature? All the environmentalists, where are they on that? Well, they're probably hiding somewhere with the free speech people and the pro-choice community, too afraid to speak up. One person who apparently is not afraid to speak up is Naomi Wolf, who is undoubtedly losing friends by appearing on the show tonight. She's the author of The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot, and the CEO of Daily Clout. She joins us tonight. Naomi Wolf, I appreciate your coming on. I never thought I would be talking to you except in a debate format. I'm sure we disagree on an awful lot. But on this, I was struck by the bravery it must have taken you to write it. I'm sure you lost friends over it and for doing this. Tell us why you're doing this and why you wrote that.
Well, it's not just, first of all, thank you, Tucker. I'm really happy to be talking to you. It's not just that one tweet. I've been writing pretty much every day for months and months about what I see as the terrible crisis that we're in, that we have to recognize under the guise of a real medical pandemic. We're really moving into a coup situation, a police state situation, and that's not a partisan thing. That, as you say, that transcends everything you and I might agree or disagree on. Right. That should bring together left and right to protect our Constitution. We're absolutely moving into what I call step 10. I wrote a book in which I pointed out there were 10 steps that would-be tyrants always take when they want to close down a democracy, whether they're on the left or the right. They always do the same 10 things, and now we're at something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. You described it really, really well. It is step 10, and that's the suspension of the rule of law. That's when you start to be a police state, and we're here. There's no way around it.
I'm so embarrassed, and it's another example, there are a million of them, of why partisanship is stupid, and it makes you stupid. And I guess I just assumed that we wouldn't agree on stuff, so I didn't read your tweets, and I obviously should have been, and I missed a lot. And so, again, it's nice to remember you should treat people as individuals rather than as stand-ins for whole political parties. You have been predicting this for a long time, you just said. Why don't you think others aren't seeing this?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of people are seeing it, but we're not unified, and as you pointed out, we're a very divided country for a lot of cynical reasons. I'm in touch with many patriots from all backgrounds and all walks of life who are horrified. I interviewed, for instance, Moms for Liberty, a group of conservative moms in Florida who are mobilizing to try to get schools open. They're so worried about what's happening to their kids. And I talked to Mom Jen Say, a famous gymnast and activist in San Francisco on the left, who's also a mom, who's horrified. I've interviewed doctors, I've interviewed ordinary people, restaurant owners from all walks of life who are absolutely unable to even articulate their fear and horror, recognizing that the state has now crushed businesses, kept us from gathering in free assembly to worship, as the First Amendment provides, is invading our bodies, as you mentioned, which is a violation of the Fourth Amendment, is restricting movement, fining us here in New York State. I could be fined $15,000 a day if I gather people, more than 10 or 25 people, depending on where in New York State I live, which is a complete violation of the First Amendment. I mean, the violations go on and on and on. I've talked to restaurant owners who are looking at a sector in which tens of thousands of small businesses have been crushed. And why were they crushed? Not because the pandemic forced them to. There is no real science underlying a lot of these closures. It's because autocratic tyrants at the state and now the national level are creating a kind of merger of corporate power and government power, which is really characteristic of Italian fascism in the 20s. And they're using that to engage in kind of emergency orders that simply strip us of our rights to property, rights to assembly, rights to worship, and all of the rights that our Constitution guarantees. So people are definitely horrified and noticing. I think people are shocked and divided, as I mentioned before. And the other thing that happened is, you said, this has all been very sudden. And when you look back, March of 2020, a lot of things started to move that kind of locked into place, a set of policies that are kind of 360-degree, full-on totalitarian policies. So I think a lot of us are kind of in culture shock. Luckily or unluckily, I've been studying closing democracies for 12 years. So I recognized early on, once I realized New York State had emergency powers, I know from history that no one gives up emergency powers willingly. They always drag it on and drag it on. And so every month I'm getting in my email an announcement that Governor Cuomo is extending emergency measures. Only from studying history do I know how predictable it is when you start to have elected officials say, we are not going to follow the Constitution because there's a pandemic. And I just want to say, lastly, and then I promise I'll stop, nowhere in the Constitution does it say all this can be suspended if there's a bad disease. We have lived through typhus, cholera, smallpox, HIV, tuberculosis, polio, the Spanish flu. We've lived through an attack on our soil. Never have there been months and months and months of emergency powers when we weren't actually fighting a war. So this is completely unprecedented. Lockdowns have never been done before in free societies, and really we're turning into a version of a totalitarian state sort of before everyone's eyes. And I really hope we wake up quickly, because history also shows that it's a small window in which people can fight back before it's too dangerous to fight back.
Man, I'm starting to think that we're being divided as a country precisely so we don't have conversations like this. And I hope you will come back. Naomi Wolf, what a pleasure, what an eye-opening pleasure it was to talk to you tonight. Thank you.
Wow, I did not expect Naomi Wolf to go on the Tucker Carlson show and have such a friendly conversation. Okay, let's learn a little bit about.
So they run a big campaign, they register people, and they actually win in Florida. They get it on the ballot, and the voters vote for it. Enthusiastically vote to raise the minimum wage in Florida. That was the beginning of the end for them. You don't do that.
From
make people very mad when you do
2011.
that. So that sort of initiated trying to figure out if they could make Acorn a kind of boogeyman in this voter fraud scandal, basically. So I moved from there to thinking about how propaganda works in American politics, and because I come to the conclusion, really, that there just simply is no evidence that this is happening at the level, individual voter level. And we have to understand the myth of voter fraud as a kind of propaganda, and how does that work? And I do that, and right in the first chapter, I give a couple of examples of that. And I look, for example, at John Fund's claims. Early in 2004, he wrote a book called Stealing Elections. And he claimed that, in fact, some of the 9/11 hijackers, he says, were actually able to register to vote in either Virginia or Florida while they made their deadly preparations for 9/11. So this is explosive, right? He said that his source was Michael Chertoff, who at the time was the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. I asked John Fund for his evidence. I asked him for his notes from that meeting, couldn't provide any of it. He wanted to get together for lunch. And I thought, well, no, I would like to see the evidence of this claim. That was the only source that he provided. And this is the way it works. A kind of spurious allegation is made, and then the allegation is repeated over and over and over and over again. And when it's repeated, it becomes news. And once it becomes news, it becomes evidence for something else. It may be evidence used in a lawsuit. One of the things, again, Republicans did through this period was they would produce booklets of news stories that they had actually generated that were sort of stories about allegations. And they would use that and they would say, this is the evidence. And they would take it to the Justice Department. And the whole U.S. attorney scandal, a number of those men and one woman were caught up in this. They had not proceeded and tried to prosecute or find or investigate voter fraud strenuously enough. And part of this was, we gave them the evidence. The evidence actually was what we kind of produced. And it's sort of, this is a little bit about the propaganda technique and tactic. So in this case with the 9/11 hijackers, Senator Kit Bond from Missouri repeats this actually on the floor of the U.S. Senate. A number of members of the House also repeat Fund's allegations. So now it's in the congressional record, and you can use it. You can say, well, here's the evidence. A senator, House members have said this. Fund then goes on to elaborate this on the Lou Dobbs program on TV. And he says, Lou Dobbs asked him, he says, I think actually some of them were registered. He slipped up a little bit. First he said they might have been registered. Then he said they were registered. And the repetition of this argument becomes a kind of code. It's a kind of communication with a constituency. And in this case, the constituency here were those who think that the registration laws are too loose. And they have been criticizing the National Voter Registration Act since it was passed in 1993. They have said that this, you shouldn't be allowed to register by mail. You should have, I don't know what you're supposed to do, fingerprint maybe, blue ink, I don't know. But there's been this obsession with this law and how it allows people to register by mail. And so this was code to them. This was a communication to them. Why? Because what Fund is referring to is that you're allowed to register to vote by going to the DMV. So when he said that some of them, we all knew that some of them had obtained driver's license, which is not illegal for a green card holder, but state IDs. And in fact, there was some forgeries and so forth among this group of people in obtaining those IDs. But the code is they went to the DMV. We know they did because we have the license evidence, and they may have been able to register to vote. So, I had a research assistant work an entire summer trying to figure out if this was correct. And in the end, I had, the election officials in Florida. They ran the names of every one of the hijackers and every known alias of the hijackers this way and that way through their database. They could not find any evidence of this. And I actually had an FBI public affairs person who said that he spoke to, quote, someone actively involved in investigating this allegation, and he said the hijackers were not registered to vote in either state. So they weren't registered to vote. But this was already out there. And I looked at this, Spencer Overton, who's a law professor, looked at this particular allegation. It's very interesting. John Fund took this out of his book when he republished it in time for the 2006 election. One other example of this propaganda kind of technique, how does it work? That's the question, how does it work? Well, you start with these spurious, exaggerated, distorted, unsupported allegations, and you offer them as fact. And the example here is an organization called the American Voting Rights, ACVR, which was launched in 2005. It existed for just under 2 years. It was one of these sort of organizations where you can't learn about who's funding them because of its tax status. One of the founders of it was a St. Louis attorney and a GOP operative named Mark Thor Hearn, and he testified at a field hearing in Ohio after the 2004 election. He testified about voting problems there, and he said that in Ohio, the NAACP was paying people with crack cocaine to get them to register to vote. He actually said this in a congressional hearing, put it on paper, made it part of a lawsuit. And within 6 months of this organization sort of appearing, and it was created by political operatives. Within 6 months, they came out with a report that they said was the most comprehensive and authoritative review of the facts surrounding allegations of vote fraud, intimidation, and suppression made during the 2004 presidential election. As I say in the book, analysis of the claims here show it to be little more than a pile of poorly scrutinized newspaper articles sensationalizing election shenanigans, allegedly instigated in all but 2 instances by Democrats. And I went through every one of the allegations in this report, every single one of these allegations. It took me a very long time to track down everything, and I found the same thing. I found these are not actual cases of fraud. These were cases of people saying, I think somebody may have committed fraud. And this becomes a news story. The news story gets transformed into evidence. There's direct kind of action to do this. And then the evidence gets spread around. And that becomes what the basis for many journalists were covering in those years. So the code here that the ACVR and their allies were using was about Democrats. Democrats, are racial minorities, criminal, low-income people, Democrats. It used to be liberals, now it's Democrats for them. And this, as I say, was sort of the basis for part of this full-blown assault on ACORN, because ACORN could become visible to the public. They didn't have to say, we think too many minority, low-income people are voting. They could just say ACORN, and ACORN doesn't exist anymore. And yet I keep up on a lot of this. People are still talking about ACORN. I mean, I've been attacked because one of the reports I did was for Project Vote, where I am now working as a research director for Project Vote, and Project Vote had a relationship with ACORN in terms of designing voter registration campaigns for them as well. So people go through, they figure all this out, and they say, oh, no wonder, ACORN, it's a good thing it died, it was committing all that fraud. And the facts are that there were very few sort of convictions. There were people who had forged registration applications and so forth. Those people were fired by ACORN. In many cases, ACORN found the fraud and handed it to the law enforcement officials, and didn't get any credit for that. So, so I think, why does this myth persist? That's the question. When the evidence is so clear that this is not the problem, and of course it persists because it serves powerful people. It's useful to powerful people. They have the means to keep it alive, and also because it's a myth, it's a parable that touches on something deep in our culture, in our history, in our society that we are not really fully done with about any.
So Kevin McDonald tweets here, Merrick Garland is clearly a very strongly identified Jew. Hard to believe it won't affect his policies. Not surprising he is targeting white supremacy as a priority. And he's commenting on an article in thehill.com. Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland chokes up about his family and how the country took us in and protected us. There's nothing about being choked up about your family and being grateful that the United States allowed your family to immigrate here that makes you a very strongly identified Jew. This is a major weakness in Kevin McDonald's scholarship, is that he keeps referring to people as obviously very strongly identifying as Jewish if they think that the Holocaust was a bad thing. So there's not much evidence that I can dig up that Merrick Garland is a very strongly identified Jew. One hand, yes, he did apparently marry a Jewish woman, but you go to Wikipedia, there's no mention of Judaism. There's no mention of him being an observant Jew. So what exactly makes him a very strongly identifying Jew? Because he chokes up about the Holocaust and how his ancestors survived the Holocaust, right? A non-Jew could choke up about the Holocaust. It doesn't make you strongly identifying. So Kevin doesn't have any standards for those whom he describes as very strongly identifying. And many of the intellectuals he describes as strongly identifying Jewish are married to non-Jews.
Inequality here in the United States. So that's kind of, the book overall traces through that little bit of a journey there. And I think that, I think actually the problem now more is the problem of propaganda, which I'm so pleased to be invited by Mark Crispin Miller to speak here, because he actually knows something about propaganda, and it's not something that we have studied, academics, in any really serious way and really fully understand. And I think in the new internet age, we really need to do that, because the internet has created this parallel reality that people think is real. In fact, there are a lot of illusions there. So I want to thank Mark very much, and thank the bookstore here for inviting me to come and tell you about this book.
Okay, that's Lorraine Minnite, The Myth of Voter Fraud.